that it is so external facing, right? I mean, if the core of our mission is critical infrastructure, 85% of critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So it's all about collaboration, why collaboration is baked into the DNA of CISA. And so a lot of time spent building relationships, building trust, building connectivity, both across the federal government, but importantly with private industry and with our state and local colleagues. So that's been pretty incredible. I'd say the second thing is I've got some great hires, very excited. Just brought on Kirsten Todd as my chief of staff. Many folks know her from the nonprofit world. And then last thing, I know we'll talk more about this, is the JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, that I am very, very excited about.
Yeah, thank you for that background. And so now you've been in 10 weeks, looking out to the next 2 or 3 years, what are you seeing as your main priorities?
Yeah, it's a great question because over the past 8 months, CISA has been given more authorities through the National Defense Authorization Act, more money through the American Rescue Plan Act, right, $650 million, and a whole boatload of responsibilities through the Cyber EO.
But no pressure.
Right, no pressure, exactly. And you know, if you think about priorities, right, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So as the director, I need to figure out how to ruthlessly prioritize where to put our resources so that we can get the mission done to help defend the nation in cyber. So I think of it in 4 buckets. So first of all, CISA's transformation. Our good friend Chris Krebs, right? He laid the foundation.
Out here somewhere,
Out here somewhere, Chris, my good friend, laid the foundation, did a fabulous job building the agency, setting the operating model. Now we need to transform it to be the nation, the agency the nation deserves. And that, to me, is all about culture. Building a culture that prizes collaboration and teamwork and trust and transparency and ownership and empowerment and innovation and inclusion, incredibly important to build a diverse workforce. And culture is all about how we attract and retain the best talent, and that's people, right? Building a talent management ecosystem where we can attract and retain the best people so that the best network defenders in the country want to come work here. So a lot of work on that. Second big priority, federal cybersecurity. So federal cybersecurity is just part of that critical infrastructure ecosystem. A lot of work in this space. There's FISMA reform. What's FISMA? Another great government acronym, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. We got to get that right. The last time they did this was 2014. There wasn't a CISA. There wasn't a national cyber director. There wasn't a federal CISO. So we need to use that to codify CISA's role as the operational lead for federal cybersecurity. And then, as we said, cyber EO, right? Huge amount of tasks. I think we lead or are part of 35 tasks in there. And I'm happy to report that we've met our highly aggressive deadlines so far, so touch wood. But that's all about visibility, right? Instantiating endpoint detection and response capability, logging. And this will really ignite some of the authorities we got from the NDAA where we can do persistent hunting on federal government networks. So important. There's modernization, secure cloud, zero trust. We just published a secure cloud technical reference architecture and a zero trust maturity model. Comment period open until Friday. So please give us your feedback on that. I've already read some great feedback, so that's very important. So that's all federal cybersecurity. We can talk more about that. Third big bucket, critical infrastructure security. I know the whole theme of this conference is systemic risk. So we'll talk about how we think about the critical infrastructure sectors and then how we think about national critical functions. Because everything is connected. I'm a big Douglas Adams fan. I don't know if you've read any of that. Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency. Everything is connected, everything is interdependent, everything is vulnerable. So it's how we think of functions. And so a lot of work on that, performance goals, and then working on the 100-day sprints from the White House with pipeline companies, energy, water, wastewater, and chemical. And then last I'd say is partnerships, right? Federal government, private industry, state and local, and then operationalized in part through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. So a lot of work to do.
Yeah, you have a busy 2 or 3 years ahead of you.
No kidding.
Well, speaking about collaboration, which has been something you've mentioned a couple of times with the private sector and with others in government, I think one question that has come up a lot is the division of labor between the NSA, the White House, CISA, and others, particularly when it comes to collaboration with the private sector and others. And I'd be curious how you're drawing the sort of cleanest lines between responsibilities?
Yeah, so thanks for that. You know, a lot has been made of this. I personally think it's a little bit of a tempest in a teapot. I think it's pretty clear what CISA's mission is, right? We lead the national effort to manage and reduce risk to critical infrastructure. We do cyber defense. That's two roles of the operational lead for federal cybersecurity, but we're also the national coordinator for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, and resilience. But at the end of the day, Kelly, like, cybersecurity is a team sport and life is a contact sport. So it's all about relationships at the end of the day, why that connectivity piece is so important. I think the great news is we are moving into a place where it's not about turf, it's not about territory, it's not about tribalism. It's about working together given the urgency of the threat environment. And so many of the folks that are in the federal government are old friends of mine who are back together again, and it's great to work with such talented teammates. But I think it's pretty clear that what we need to do is to leverage the talents and the authorities and the capabilities across the federal government so that we can motivate collective action. I think that's most important. You know, I would just point to one real value add in this space, and I think that's Chris Inglis, who I know we'll hear from on Friday. You know, a great friend, a great teammate. I think the country is really lucky to have someone who is articulate, as smart, and then genetically wired to be collaborative. We talk almost every day, and he's a fantastic partner. So I think the space is maybe crowded, but it's a space where we are creating more coherence, more cohesion every day so that we can get the mission done.
Yeah, and it's really fortunate that you and Chris and Ann and others have such a long sort of history working together. And then moving on to the collaboration with the private sector, I think you're in a great position, having just left the private sector and one of the more heavily regulated industries in the private sector, to think about, you know, what are the main challenges that you're seeing there? What do you see as the opportunities?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Let me talk a little bit about the JCDC, because I'm really excited about this. You know, this came out of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where so many fabulous ideas emerged and then found themselves instantiated in the NDAA. You know, a significant accomplishment, really. And one of them was this Joint Cyber Planning Office. And so based on that, we developed the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, because it's more than planning. If you look at the legislation, it talks about planning, it talks about exercising, it talks about actually implementing operations. And I have to say, one of the really cool things about this is it's the only federal cyber entity in statute, in law, that combines the power of the federal cyber ecosystem, so CISA, NSA, FBI, DoD, Cybercom, ODNI, together with the power of the private sector to enable us to come together, create a common operating picture of the threat, to plan and exercise against the most serious threats to the nation, and then to implement plans to be able to drive risk against those serious threats. And so when you think about some of the challenges like SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, a lot of that was about a lack of visibility, because we know if you can't see it, you can't defend it. We don't want the US government on domestic infrastructure, of course, but we want that partnership with those companies that have broad visibility. It's why the initial plank holders were ISPs and CSPs and cybersecurity vendors. So the whole point is we can use this to see the dots, to connect the dots, and then drive collective action to reduce risk at scale. So I'm really excited about that. We've kicked it off. We're already seeing some of the benefits from sharing broadly. And I think that that's going to allow us to really make some significant progress in this space.
And I've been curious, now that you bring up the JCSC, how are you can you speak now about how you're operationalizing that? How often you're meeting? How large are the groups? What is the sort of practical aspect?
Yeah, JCDC. It's like ACDC, but with a J.
Thank you.
And the J is important because it may be CISA hosted, but this is really a platform for the federal government to come together. And so we've already brought together the plank holder partners. There's 15 of them. And we've already seen, by being able to share information with some of those partners on threats that we have seen on the FCEB, the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, another horrible acronym that the government uses, sharing that information with the private sector. They can look and see if they see it in their space and then share it back. So we've been able to illuminate actually potential victims in other places, and we've been able to get that information out and do notifications. So we are just on the cusp of this. We've just operationalized it. But we should think of it really as a platform, right? This is about bringing together the power of the federal government, and it's not just the plank holder partners. Very encouragingly, we've had outreach from over 120 entities who want to be part of this. And we can pivot this as a platform for information sharing and for planning and exercising, whether it's critical infrastructure. We'll probably work with the pipeline industry as part of this 100-day sprint. And then we can work with a variety of other partners. And I think we will likely end up turning this into the election security space as we approach 2022.
Great. I'd love to come back to questions around your role in elections in a
me
moment.
too.
But first, curious, as you mentioned before, the theme of this conference is systemic cyber risk. And CISA, of course, houses the National Risk Management Center, and as I understand it, launched the Systemic Cyber Risk Reduction Venture. And would love to just hear more about the goals of that initiative, where you see it going over the next few years.
Yeah. So I think this is super cool, right? I was at an event with Chris Roberti, who's at the Chamber of Commerce, and he referred to the National Risk Management Center as a national treasure, which is actually kind of cool. I didn't know much about NRMC before I got here, but it really is a place where analytic innovation happens. And one of the most important things that they've done over the last several years under Chris Krebs' leadership and Bob Kolaski, who leads the NRMC, is to essentially reimagine systemic risk. So we have 16 critical infrastructure sectors, but you really can't think of sectors in silos at the end of the day, because going back to my point about interconnected, interdependent. And so you have the 16 sectors, but we publish the 55 national critical functions, because everything's functional, right? And so what this venture will allow us to do is sort of three things pivoting off that work on NCF. One is to understand the underlying architecture of systemic risk. So breaking down, decomposing those functions into specific capabilities that critical infrastructure sectors will have to put efforts and resources against. So that's important. The second thing is to develop cyber metrics. Anybody who's been in this business knows the elusive cyber metrics, right? Exactly. So a lot of important work there. It's one of the things that I hope in the NDAA, the next one, they get the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, another great idea brought to you by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. But we really need a way to better understand the environment and to measure the environment. We all know you got to measure what matters, so that's important. And then the third is really to come up with ways to promote tools to enable us to analyze risk in a systematic and holistic way. And I would give you an example of work around software assurance. So one of the things we're focused on is part of our information communications technology, it's another great acronym, Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is looking at all of the things we can do to reduce systemic risk around supply chains. Obviously a big focus area coming off the back of solar wind. So I'm really excited to talk more about this. I know we've got Jay Healy, who's one of our CARES Act hires somewhere out there. But I think it's a really, really important project.
Thank you for that. And next up, there's been a lot of congressional activity and discussion around mandatory cyber incident reporting. And would love to know, and I think you talked some about this last week, whether you support this work, whether there's any specific legislation that you've endorsed. I think having come from the private sector, you would have a really great perspective on the costs and benefits of that.
Yeah, so I think it's really important. As I said, we are a voluntary and a partnership agency.
Yes.
And so the
mandates get a little harder.
Exactly. So you build, our whole goal is to build trusted partnerships so that companies that are impacted by cyber attacks report information, and we do have that. But as the Congress has recognized, it is critically important that we get more and more information given the complex threat environment that we're all facing. And so we have seen several bills come out about cyber incident reporting legislation. The administration is broadly supportive of this. Certainly CISA is supportive. And the reason why we're supportive, whether it's voluntary or whether it's mandatory, we need to get that information as rapidly as possible so that we can share it to prevent others from suffering an attack, right? In a perfect world, and this is all about what we talk about collective defense, in a perfect world, and I realize this is not a perfect world we live in, you would not see the same attack twice. And so we've been working.
Yeah, we have not had that luck.
I know, exactly. Well, I said perfect, right? It's the ideal world. But the more that we can use our platform, because CISA's superpower is really our information sharing authorities. We have the most broad information sharing authorities across the federal government. It came out of 9/11, right? That's why they built DHS. And so we can use that platform in an anonymized way, protecting the civil liberties, the privacies, but sharing that information to prevent other victims from falling victim to these attacks. And in the world of ransomware, that's incredibly important. So we are excited about the potential for that legislation. But to your point, having just come from Morgan Stanley, we want to make sure, and I've said this last week, and I said it yesterday at a separate talk, that CISA is not overburdened with noise, and that we're not overburdening industry with reporting noise. So that's why it's really important to have this rulemaking period where we can figure out the scope of the reporting entities, called covered entities, when they would need to report rapidly, but again, signal, not noise, and then how you make sure that you can do enforcement. Because at the end of the day, it really is to the benefit of the whole ecosystem if we can get information out rapidly to protect others.
Yeah. Thank you. And now I wanted to come back to your point about elections earlier and the thoughts that you're having about CISA's role there. I know that in 2020, I think you all had launched the rumor control rebuttal site. My understanding is that you intend to continue with that. But I'm curious what else you're imagining doing in the election space, how you see that changing, and how you see yourself collaborating with other responsible federal entities.
Yeah. So great question. As we know, elections are run by state and local officials. They are on the front lines of making sure that their elections are secure and resilient. The federal government, CISA specifically, because we're the sector risk management agency for election infrastructure, we are here to help, to make sure that state and local officials have the resources, the technical assistance, the guidance, the information that they need to be successful. And here's where just another shout out to Chris, because he and his team, folks like Matt Masterson, did just an amazing job of building strong collaborative partnerships with the election security community, who were highly skeptical in 2017 when election infrastructure was declared critical infrastructure. You know, I was a private citizen in 2020, but I really appreciated what I saw, and it's only been reinforced since I came into the job and met with secretaries of state and state and local officials who have told me how pleased they were and how appreciative they were of CISA's role. So we plan to continue that.
Yeah, you hear again and again how much work went into building those relationships and that trust.
Yeah, just absolutely amazing work. So really proud of the agency. I can't take much credit for it, but we are looking forward. You know, elections happen all the time, as I'm reminded by officials, but we're in particular looking towards 2022 to make sure that state and local election officials have everything they need. Kelly, you also asked about misinformation, so rumor control. When I looked at this as a private citizen, I saw what CISA was doing, which is really making sure that the American people have the facts that they need. You know, I worry a lot about misinformation and disinformation as a citizen, but also as a mom, right? If you don't have the facts, if you don't have the best information, you can't make the best decisions. So we are going to continue with rumor control, and we're going to also continue with some innovative things. We do graphic novels, which are kind of cool.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they're kind of cool. I'm happy. I'll send you I'll send it to you. And you know, Chris came up with the pineapple pizza. Craig Newmark remarked on it yesterday. So that's Chris's trademark. I need to come up with something else. It's probably like Rubik's Cubes, 80s music, dragons, something. We're working through what our signs will be. But it really is about energizing the community, focused on, you know, one of the most important things, right? Free and fair elections are the foundations of our democracy. So a lot of effort there.
And how do you see that work around elections interfacing with other federal organizations? I know the FBI has some role here, not, you know, at least around disinformation. You have many other players involved.
Yeah, the other thing I'd point to, you know, there was a fabulous relationship across the federal government in elections. If you looked at any of this, it was CISA, But we worked very closely with NSA, very closely with FBI, and very closely with Cybercom. There was a task force of folks that were constantly in touch to make sure that we were bringing to bear all of the instruments of national power, both to support state and local, but then to do everything we could to prevent foreign malign influence on our elections. And obviously this came out of 2016. So it really was a team effort. And that really makes it easier for me to continue to build on the quality and the strength of those partnerships across the federal cyber ecosystem. And so again, still a lot of work to do, but a great baseline to build upon.
Right. Now I'd love to take sort of a bigger step back. So we've talked about elections, we've talked about incidents reporting, we've talked about the JCDC. Having come into this new role, what have been the biggest surprises for you, good or bad? What has surprised you?
Yeah, so I would say, it's my first time in the Department of Homeland Security. And I honestly did not know what to expect. And I loved my time at Morgan Stanley. Great firm, great teammates, great mission, great culture, great lifestyle. And the reason that I got out of government was to be with my son. I was deployed.
How old is he?
He's 17 now.
Oh, so you have just a little window left there.
I know, and he decided to go off to boarding school, which I don't think is something about me, but.
Yes.
So, I was deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, I was at the White House. I didn't get to spend much time when he was growing up, and so he was going to become a teenager. I knew that he needed me.
How great that you had those 5 years.
Maybe he didn't think that, yeah. So we did, it was fabulous. And so, when you get the call and you need to serve, and service is in your DNA. So came back into government, I will tell you, this is the best job. This is the best job I've had. I believe it's the best job in government. And I think it is because it is so external facing. It's all about relationships. My friend Jane Lute, the former DepSec of Homeland Security and a former professor of mine at West Point, she has this great saying. She said, in national security, counterterrorism, intelligence, the federal government has a monopoly. In Homeland Security, cybersecurity, the federal government is just a co-equal partner with the private sector and with state and local. And so it's all about collaboration and partnership. And so I love it. In terms of surprises, not so great. The bureaucracy is still there. Bureaucracy is bad when you have to move at the speed of cyber, but I am ready to slay the bureaucracy, slay the dragons. I think there is the sense of urgency, given what we've seen over the last 8 months, that we're at a unique moment in time where we can make a real impact on the defense and security of our nation.
Well, thank you. And then one last, somewhat self-serving question before we have to wrap, which is my background is in philanthropy. Really curious, as we're trying to think about bringing more philanthropy into this space and how civil society can better support government here and the private sector, what do you see as the main roles that we could play? Yeah,
it's a fabulous question. Thank you for your leadership at Hewlett. Thanks to you and actually Eli, who supported the nonprofit.
Big shout out to Eli.
Big shout out to Eli. And then also I know Ron and Cindy Gula are here. We actually got some support for the nonprofit that I set up, Theorem Media. We did Cyber Nation. And I know Craig is out here as well. And so it's so important that more funding goes to the cyber philanthropy community. I know there was a great letter published earlier this year all about this, and absolutely critical, right, at the end of the day, that there's a real focus on this. I think of this, I guess I'd say a couple of things, and I had this conversation with my friend Tony Sager, who's at the Center for Internet Security. There are a lot of these great organizations out there. I think it'd be great to figure out how some of these can come together to harmonize these efforts. There's a lot of work on best practices. There's a lot of work on cyber workforce. So is there a way that all the nonprofits can come together to optimize the best of? And I'd love to figure out how we can do that, because we're doing our own things in this space. We're about to award grants to nonprofits for underserved communities. So that's one thing. But I think if we have a focus on two big things, one is building a diverse and inclusive cyber workforce. We had some great conversations about that. And that's something I'm incredibly passionate about, because I believe diversity of thought, background, and experience helps you solve the hardest problems much quicker. And the other thing is building resilience, both cyber resilience as well as digital resilience in terms of being able to know how to protect yourself in cyber.
At the
If you
citizen
do
level.
that from the youngest of ages to the oldest, I like to say K through gray, and you make it easy on people. And quick plug for October coming up Friday, Cybersecurity
Awareness Month.
Right? It's helping people understand the basics that they can do to keep themselves safe online. And so I think there's a lot that the nonprofit sector can do to make sure that we're getting out to communities all over, to schools all over, to do the basics, right? At the end of the day, it's updating your software, it's password managers, it's thinking before you click.
Yeah.
And it's, I'm on this big campaign here all about implementing multi-factor authentication.
Yes.
So I am doing a shameless plug and expect all the cyber evangelizers out there. Because I think if there's only one thing you can do, the industry studies show you are 99% less likely to get hacked if you implement MFA. So we are all in this together. I'm a huge fan of the nonprofit ecosystem, what you're doing, what all of our teammates in this space are doing, and I hope to be able to work with all of you to advance a really important mission.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for this conversation and for your leadership
My
here.
pleasure.
It's great to see you.
As well. Thanks so much, Kelly.
Vivian, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly and Jen. And in case anybody missed it, there was some breaking news in there. Just to repeat, pineapple on pizza is going to be retired. It's going to be retired. There's going to be a new mascot metaphor. Jen, I'm actually thinking dragons is the way to go, so I just want to put my vote in there. Excellent. She's got the dragon pants. Okay, so that was a actually perfect introduction to this year's Cyber Summit, which is focused on systemic cyber risk. That really was a fantastic landscape of all of the issues that everyone in the industry, whether the public sector, the private sector, needs to confront. And for our next section, we're going to do a pretty deep dive into what we mean by systemic cyber risk. So it is my pleasure to introduce Jay Healy, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University, Wenda Snyder, the CEO of Thistle Technologies, and Jonathan Welburn, an operations researcher at the RAND Corporation. And moderating our next session is our very own, one of my favorite colleagues, they're all my favorites, David Forsey, Managing Director of the Aspen Cyber Security Group. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Vivian. I'm so happy right now for so many reasons. Not only because this is the first in-person meeting I've been to, I think many of us have been to in almost 2 years, many of us too, but I get to talk about the cybers with three of the smartest people, who I believe the smartest people in the field. And so let's just get into it. So first, the hardest question. Are cyber attacks getting worse? Is it an illusion? Is it the way we cover them? Or are we really entering a new phase where new pieces of critical infrastructure are coming under attack in new ways? So I'm going to put that to all of you. Jonathan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, great question. I think we all feel like it's definitely getting a lot worse. I would say on that a lot of that attention comes on ransomware, and for good reason. I think that the ransomware attackers have found a perfectly successful, illegitimate business model, and every time there's a large-scale attack, and with Colonial, we see that they issue a payment and it solves the problem. It's a really good advertisement for that business model. So I think that we're seeing more of those brazen attacks where they're willing to go after large targets, which can get a large sum of money.
I would say that in addition to the attacks being demonstrated successful, that we've also got this growing complexity and growing interdependence. And so the opportunities are growing faster than we are able to mitigate them as an industry.
Yeah, and I love both of those. And so we've been here before. 20 years ago, say from the late 90s to up to maybe 2003, it was relatively routine to see large-scale attacks take down substantial parts of the internet, right? They went by NIMDA, Code Red, SQL Slammer, Melissa, I Love You, right? Almost every quarter, we would just be awash with a worm that would disrupt substantial parts of the internet. So we've been here. And so what's changed is, well, one, we haven't changed, right? Most of the reasons that let those worms spread so quickly and take down so much, we haven't really mitigated. in a substantial way. Yes, we have, and Microsoft has made big changes, others have made big changes, but a lot of the fundamental vulnerabilities are still there. I love the points about interdependence and monetization that have come up. But we've also seen changes in adversary behavior. I think things that we thought adversaries, not just, but particularly nation states, we would say, well, folks just aren't going to go past this line. And we've just continued to see that over the past 20 years.
So one of the scariest things about ransomware, obviously, is that people are using shared vulnerabilities among many systems to launch a single attack that affects many, many individuals across the system, right? Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why the theme of this summit is systemic risk. So Jay, going back to you real quick, how do we define systemic risk, especially in a digital society? What is systemic cyber risk?
You can think about it as if you've got a system, facility, asset, if you're an entity, a company, your importance to the system is greater than just what you have to yourself. The work that I started doing in this, we were looking at correlations of cyber risk, and some WAG started calling it, this 2014, cyber subprime. Like, the last thing we need is another cyber this or a cyber that, referring to the 2008-2009 credit crunch. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it's actually a fabulous analogy. Because going into the credit crunch, you had these pools of risk, right? You had this financial risk that was pooling in places that was misunderstood, not understood, and it had this cascading effect when it finally broke. And the more expert you were, the more that you would have said, it is impossible that these risks are correlated. And so it's up to us on the cyber side to say, all right, well, where do we have these IT companies that are too big to fail, if you accept that part of the analogy? We've got common mode failures or common cause failures. And we saw this in SolarWinds, right, where everybody is using the same software, and an issue with that piece of IT will affect everyone. We see cyber cascading failures. Just this week, there's a big outage of Amazon Web Services. Right, so something happens to this piece of IT infrastructure that then affects many, many others in the real economy. And we've got these physical cascades, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline. It's a cyber incident, in this case ransomware, and the cascade wasn't on the cyber side, it was on the physical side because we didn't have enough fuel in the Northeast.
So Window, so we just got kind of a theoretical treatment of systemic risk. What are some practical examples of how systemic risk manifests that you can think of?
Sure. So on the critical infrastructure side, there was an attack on Dyn that took them down for a while. It was a denial of service attack. And the set of folks who depend on Dyn went down, and that's
for
reasonable
our audience,
to expect.
Could you just explain what Dyn is?
Oh, it's a DNS provider. So that's critical in an obvious way. If you can't find your way to the server, then the server's not available to you. And so that goes down and their customers go down, and that's expected. But what's not expected is the number of customers that depend on those customers and the number of customers that depend on those customers. And eventually, we recognize the interdependency of all of these cloud services that might not be directly relying on Dyn, but are relying on somebody who's relying on Dyn. And then you take a company like Slack, which you might not recognize as critical infrastructure, but all these different cloud service providers are using Slack as their communication mechanism for operations. And so when Dyn goes down and Slack depends on Dyn, and Slack's not available, and Slack is what everyone else is using to manage their operations and try and recover from an outage and move to a different provider on short notice, and their communication channel is down, we have all of these interdependencies and failures that pop up in unexpected ways. At this point, I'm hoping all those folks have a back-end IRC server or something to address that, or maybe just phone numbers that on a piece of paper written down, anything. But it really revealed, that one in particular really revealed our interdependency in the cloud. But we have similar interdependencies in technology. Whether it's a library that's widespread, like OpenSSL, when Heartbleed came out, and we saw how many people were scrambling to find all the different places that specific library was incorporated into the technologies that their organization depended on. So whether you are a product developer and you recognize that you've got it incorporated over here, you also have it in this part of your product, or you're a CISO and you're trying to figure out, for all the different products I have, which of these are using it, and the answer was essentially all of them. Trying to even address this specific vulnerability in your infrastructure was just a can of worms, and everywhere you looked, you found another technology that was dependent on this specific issue. And this is a technology that's probably one of the most inspected by security researchers out there. So imagine all of these other technologies, all these other libraries or components that have vulnerability to the same degree or to a much more significant degree that is not getting that same level of inspection and that is vulnerable in a way that's quiet. Or like SolarWinds, a technology that we're deploying in a lot of critical places that is compromised, and a legitimate update is pushed with malware inside of it, and now we've got this problem deployed everywhere. So the core problem here is complexity and our interdependence. And that is something that we're not going to move away from, because that is providing us flexibility and functionality and all these other critical functions that we need. So we've got a growing problem here.
Jay, before coming to you, Jonathan, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And if I could just build on Windows' fabulous points, like look at SolarWinds, right? It's a big company, right? It's got IT security, like it's a large entity, it's a large organization. And compare that to one of the other ones you said, Heartbleed, right? It was working on the OpenSSL, and how many developers are working on OpenSSL, right? I mean, a dozen, 2 dozen contributors, main contributors, and it is absolutely critical to web commerce, right? I mean, you're just not able to do so much, and it had this unknown dependency. And so we have to worry about these hidden pools of risk that can be large companies that everybody in IT knows, to these critical pieces that are just maintained by a handful of important people, and yet underpin everything that we're doing on the internet.
So we've got a lot of dependencies we're talking about. We've got the domain name system, open source infrastructure, suppliers. How do we actually identify where we should be paying the most attention? Jonathan, I know you've done a lot of work on this. How do you measure systemic risk, and how do you identify the pain points, the single points of failure where we could have a cascading effect begin?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, first of all, it's definitely a difficult problem, and acknowledging why it's difficult before I explain how to get into solutions is, typically when you want to look at different types of risk, you might say, let's look at historical data. Let's see what the past incidents have been. And when we do that for cyber, when we look at systemic cyber risk, the incidents that we may be observing in the past are just a part of a larger distribution. And so we know that we're not necessarily seeing the full distribution. And there might be different reasons for that. There can be underreporting. That could be one reason why we aren't able to observe everything. But another problem is it just might not have happened yet. So we've seen a lot of large cyber incidents, like some of the ones that we've discussed, SolarWinds and Dyn. But those might not be the worst of what Jay was actually talking about when he was defining systemic cyber risk. And so actually getting into measuring what could pose that type of systemic cyber risk probably requires a different approach, which is more in the modeling, the simulation, and the hypotheticals. And one of the approaches that I've been doing, work I've been doing with colleague Aaron Strong and the broader team at RAND, has been kind of following the way you were describing Dyn, right? Where you have where they go down, and they have this list of customers, and then there's those knock-on effects, and it kind of cascades out through these networks. Well, saying, if we are able to start getting into that network structure a little bit more, and seeing who depends on Dyn, who depends on Box or something was hit. The different companies are hit after that. Who depends on Box after that? And trying to understand that network structure. Well, at that point, you can start asking the hypotheticals. Well, what happens if there is this type of cyber incident at this given company, this given service? How would that then ripple out? What would the aggregate impacts be? And that's an approach for starting to answer this question of how do you measure the potential systemic risk posed by a given company or service. It's only part of it. I think there's a lot of other things, like what Jay was talking about, when you're getting into code repositories and there's where there's things which are widely shared across many other across many services and products that would be really difficult to measure.
Do either of you want to add to that?
Just that Jonathan's work and the work that RAND has done, it's been really groundbreaking. It's really changed how I look at this.
So a lot of the way we approach cybersecurity as a society, as a government, norms building is based on individual defense, right? So let's figure out how to make sure company X does Y to protect their own data, right? But what you're describing here seems to require a different approach, right? Because a lot of the risk is outside of the perimeter of the individual company, right? So what does it mean to actually, how do we change our approach to prioritize systemic defense instead of just individual defense? And let's start with you, Jay, and then go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different ways we can do it, right? We've been looking at other kinds of systemic risk, right? We've handled this for the energy sector and for the finance sector, for example, because we've said you need to be regulated because your risks are higher. In the finance sector, where I had partially come from, Goldman Sachs and other banks would be called a globally systemically important bank based on a relatively simple set of criteria. How large are you? How interconnected are you? How leveraged are you? And things like that. And therefore, you had a much larger role in the system. And if you went down, you have global regulations that you have to fit, not only your national regulator. And so in those places where we've got existing regulation, we can look at, all right, for those sectors, how might the government use those existing regulations? But in other places, most especially within the IT sector, we don't have such regulations in place, and it's hard to get our heads around, well, how would you quite regulate to be able to get there? You might say regulate for notification, and we've been seeing a lot coming up in Congress on that. If you are affected, Colonial Pipeline, SolarWinds, you need to tell the government so that we can at least understand what's happening. And the last idea that I really liked, it came out very strongly from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which Director Easterly mentioned earlier this morning, where they had an idea. It had the kind of unfortunate name of SICI, Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure, and saying, boy, some of these entities in critical infrastructure really do have a larger systemic importance. And that's both to say, if something happens, the impact is really bad, emphasizing the negative aspect. But I liked it because they also emphasized the positive side. These are the partners that the government can most work with to mitigate systemic risk. And I like both parts of that, and I'm really pleased to see that CISA has a systemic cyber risk reduction venture that they're doing within the NRNC.
Wenda?
I think regulatory involvement is required, but we need to recognize that it only operates at a lower threshold, right? That it knocks out kind of the low-hanging fruit, which is important because there are a lot of organizations that haven't even gone that far. But the attackers are more sophisticated than that, and I don't know that it's going to address the larger scale problems that we have. And this is kind of getting to the area that I think is the biggest monster on the bed as far as I'm concerned. That imagine all the attacks that we just described have been happening for 20 plus years, and we just didn't do anything as an industry. We didn't implement better technologies. We didn't get better at mitigating these strategies. We didn't reduce our attack surface. We didn't work on memory corruption issues. We didn't do any of the work to harden these systems that we rely on and develop resilience into these systems. And now you've got the device space. And in the device space, which is growing in complexity and growing in our dependence on these devices is also growing. We've got.
Can you just say like what kind of devices you mean?
Sure, automotive, aeronautics, manufacturing equipment, corporate devices like printers and security cameras, your refrigerator, everything. I mean, literally everything is essentially has a computer in it. And for a completely reasonable set of decisions, you try to reduce, as a device manufacturer, you try to reduce the complexity in these devices because you want them to be highly reliable. So you pare down your system to just the critical functionality. But a lot of them either have operating systems that are so tiny that they don't have security mechanisms that we've leveraged in general purpose operating systems for the last 20 years, or they didn't bother to build it in. And a lot of them don't have privilege separation, and a lot of them don't have separation between code and execution. And you end up with a device that has all of the opportunity that the general purpose devices, whether it's in the data center, or it's your workstation, or even your, at this point I'm going to call your mobile phone more of a general purpose device and less of an embedded device, just because they have so much functionality and so much security work goes into those OSs. But you end up with a device that's sitting on the network, has access to critical networks and systems in your corporate environment, in your government environment, and then didn't do any of the security work that general purpose operating systems have been doing for 20 years. And so how do we get to a place where we are able to make those devices as resilient as these general purpose operating systems, given that they have the same risks, but are much more resource constrained than the general purpose operating systems, because a lot of these devices are not plugged into a wall, and a lot of these devices don't have the same amount of memory or storage or CPU capabilities. So to implement security functions in these devices is a different challenge. But it's a huge opportunity for attackers, and it's very difficult for the people who manage these devices to be able to even inspect these devices and recognize whether they are actually compromised or are using the code that we intended for them to run at deployment. So that's the big hairy monster under the bed for me. And if we're going to take on something as an industry and say that there's something appropriate that needs to happen here, then being able to update those devices effectively, so when a vulnerability is identified, that we can actually do something about it. And updating devices is harder than updating general purpose operating systems or your web browser, for example, because the failure of an update for your web browser means that maybe you have to try it again, or you have to reboot your system at the worst, whereas the failure of a device could mean that somebody has to go out with a USB plug onto the manufacturing floor and update it manually, or maybe somebody has to go visit thousands of ATMs all over the US and address them individually. Or maybe it means that satellite is just gone for good, right? Updating a device is a much more risky endeavor, but it means that it's much harder to address the security issues that we know about already in devices, and it's not unreasonable that the device manufacturers are reluctant to deploy those kinds of updates, knowing that what failure means for availability for the folks who depend on them.
So in other words, we have billions of devices that are too simple to have good security.
No.
No? Okay.
That don't have good security yet. They absolutely can, but we have to make that a priority.
Right.
And if I can, one of the implications of this, remember when I said 20 years ago we kept having these major worms that were hitting? Well, the worms were only taking down things made of silicon and things made of ones and zeros. Because that's all that was really on the internet. Because of this trend that Window just talked about, right? Now we have the attacks, and they're not just taking things down made of silicon and ones and zeros. They can take down things made of concrete and steel. So it was really difficult to really hurt someone or kill someone when all you were disrupting was silicon and ones and zeros. Now that we're taking down can take down concrete and steel and these other devices that Window just talked about, right? I think we're going to look back at the 2000s and the 2010s as the golden age when no one was really dying from this stuff. Because now you can have these systemic attacks that have a much lower threshold of the kind of adversary that can have these kinds of capabilities that really can be a matter of life and death, and will be if they haven't already.
Well, we know a delay of medical care by X amount of time increases mortality rates by X amount of time, and what, two-thirds of the NHS system in the United Kingdom went down during, was it WannaCry? Right?
Substantial with WannaCry, yeah.
So, Jonathan, we've talked about, do you have anything to add, or would you like to go back to how we can actually manage this? Or?
I'll add to this and maybe wander that direction. So I think it's really interesting listening to Window's points, because there's this kind of irony to this, where the objective of all of these devices, of really fundamentally the internet in itself is interconnectedness, right? And I think that it's been a lot of these products have done a great job at that task. I think that as you were talking about how this is the first time we're at a conference or a live event in 2 years. I mean, we've gotten on pretty well due to how well interconnected we are through a lot of these devices and services. But the irony of that is that we're here talking about how these are really too interconnected to fail, and that how they pose a systemic risk if they were to. I love a good finance metaphor, as Jay was making several, and maybe following on some of Jay's finance metaphors, I think that I wasn't in the room when they came up with the term "sickie" and the solarium, and it sounds silly, but I imagine if I could peer into their head, I imagine they were following the SIFI reference, so SIFI, sickie, which I love the idea behind that, and that there was a lot of lessons that we could learn from all of the previous work that's been done on systemic risk. So I just want to make a point on this of, perhaps where systemic cyber risk is similar to systemic risk, and also where it's different. I think that with all of the work that had been done by academics, by analysts, by policymakers following 2008 and before too, about what it meant to be systemically important, there's a lot of great things where Goldman becomes systemically important, where you're saying that due to the interconnectedness of this entity, due to of this institution in that context, due to the complexity of this institution, if it were to fail, how difficult would it be to unwind it? Due to the substitutability as well. These are three general types of criteria that you could say would help you understand.
Sorry, could you just say a little bit more about substitutability?
Substitutability meaning, how easy would it be if this institution failed for its assets to shift to another, or you replace its service with another?
If one cloud failure happens, you can switch to another cloud provider.
Exactly, yeah. How easily can you switch to another cloud provider? So in this context, and that's exactly right, because we can carry some of those points forward into thinking about how to identify and how to manage systemic cyber risk in the systemically important cyber sickie that we're calling it. So I think those are great points that we can carry forward. Another one too, actually, is that systemic risk, whether it be in finance, environment, or cyber, or elsewhere, is inherently a multi-stakeholder problem, where you can't easily manage this problem by yourself as one organization at a time. Obviously, you can do the multi-factor authentication that Assistant Director Easterly was talking about before. Great way to actually move the ball forward. But when we're talking about systemic risk, it's not up to one organization, being a firm or being one agency in government. It really does require a lot of broader cooperation to actually tackle this type of problem. And so it's exciting to hear more discussions about that, a lot of interagency discussion, and to have the various folks in the room that we're all talking is really the right direction.
So I want to go back to, were you going to say something else?
I was going to say how they're different.
Okay, right, great.
So one point about how they're different is that systemic risk in economics and finance is caused by, it's not exactly one group's fault. It is often caused by, you could call it misaligned capital, that's excessive capital in one area of the economy that's overly risky, and you get a crisis. Systemic cyber risk is not that. It is an adversarial type of problem. It's fundamentally caused by it can be caused by a group or an individual which targets the right entity at the right time.
And that also means that the intelligent adversary can circumvent all the risk management practices you put into place that, you can't pass a Dodd-Frank to prevent an attacker from leveraging an attack on DNS infrastructure, things like that. I want to go back to regulation real quick. Devil's advocate here. The free market creates all the incentives you need, all the incentives that companies need to prevent a systemic shock. They have every interest in preventing a systemic shock. So get your big government out of here. Why do you need to regulate that? It's one thing if you're regulating data protection, where maybe they actually don't have an incentive to protect customer data. But why would we need to regulate systemic resilience when it's in everyone's interest to be resilient? And start with you, Jay, and then come back down.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So as a former CISO, one of the problems that I ran up against frequently was trying to identify which of the technologies in my organization had incorporated this other technology that was vulnerable, like the OpenSSL example that I just gave. The bill of materials would make it easier for organizations to identify where they are vulnerable when new vulnerabilities are identified.
Could you say what a bill of materials is?
Letting us know which technologies are incorporated into the technologies that you trust. And
Like an
this
ingredients list.
Like an ingredients list, yeah. And so one of the things that I don't think that industry is going to do this necessarily by themselves if there isn't some regulatory requirement. A lot of folks don't want to identify all this attack surface that they may have. They don't want to necessarily reveal that they are vulnerable when a vulnerability is identified in one of these components until they're ready to, until they have a patch available, et cetera. There are a lot of factors here that are working against that aspect of transparency. But from the CISO's perspective, it's a lot easier to mitigate the issue if you know about it, even if you don't have a patch available from the vendor. And while there are organizations that are not going to be able to jump in front of it and do something about it because that information is available, and you are giving the attackers a laundry list of places to go shopping when they've got a vulnerability in hand, and they can wait to just be opportunistic about these issues for when they're identified by somebody else. They don't even have to do the work. They can just wait, and a security researcher will be able to do that work for them. And this gives them an opportunity of places to go deploy that. And it takes a lot of time for us to address these issues, to mitigate them, et cetera. But I can't do anything if I don't know it's there. So either the burden is on each organization to reverse engineer every single technology that they're using in order to understand all the other technologies that they're using, which that's completely undoable, or for us to regulate, understanding how all these technologies are interdependent so that we have a chance of being able to mitigate them or turn something off when we know that there's a serious issue that we may or may not have a patch available yet from the vendor.
So promoting software transparency through regulation. Right.
That's one thing.
Jay, were you going to say something?
And that's a phrase that I use a lot, and I love that we got there. To me, if you're going to have to regulate, I want to regulate for transparency. Right? If we regulate for security, there's much too great a chance that we're going to lock in some kind of, like, even if we say you must have two-factor, well, we're already starting to move past two-factor in a lot of advanced places. And so, but if you regulate for transparency, well, now you can allow the market to try and work better. And not just the market, but we can allow other aspects of American society and capitalism to work better. An example, the SEC originally had guidance that said if you have a materially significant cyber incident, I don't care that it's cyber, it's materially significant and you have to tell your shareholders. Now that went from guidance, it became a regulation, there are still some gaps there, but they didn't say, the SEC didn't say your security has to be this tall to be on this ride. They said you have to treat this like any other risk and you have to tell your shareholders. Most of the way that we know about what's happened, well, a lot of the ways that we know and researchers like John knows about what's happened is through things like SEC reporting. So I love that. Is there other ways that we can get the shareholders, if companies are taking bad risks, then the main way we handle that as society is saying, all right, well, the board of directors on behalf of the shareholders should be keeping the executives of that company to task if they're taking dumb risks. So I want to see, what can we do to reinforce that? For example, before Y2K, CalPERS, the biggest institutional investor in the world, I think, or close to it, went to every one of their companies and said, what are you doing for Y2K? You must tell us as an active shareholder. What can we do to try and tap in to those things to make it work? Frankly, and I'm interested in what Window thinks, right? I think of the large platforms, you've been seeing more stewardship of the larger set of problems, right? Sometimes for self-interest, like Microsoft in 2003, like that wave of worms that I talked about, ended in large part because Microsoft started to take this seriously. What I would like to see is a lot of the venture capital, a lot of the innovation is going into technology that works in the enterprise. And we had done some work at something called the New York Cyber Task Force that said, you don't get the leverage there, right? You've got to do it, but you actually do better in technology that helps across cyberspace as a whole.
What do you mean by leverage?
Yeah, like look at, for example, imagine we invented the perfect widget that is going to help protect against a wide range of attacks. We've got to sell 1 billion of those widgets to every organization that needs to be protected against the attack. They have to figure out how to configure it. They have to train people on how to do it. They have to keep it maintained and up to date. They have to keep it patched. They have to integrate it to the rest of their environment. If we can do one thing like end-to-end encryption, automated update, right? Those are things that got done once, and then it got to help 1 billion enterprises or people afterwards. And unfortunately, so much of the innovation is aiming at technology within the enterprise, and we're overlooking this technology across cyberspace as a whole. And just to close, we're also tending to ignore the operational innovations. We had to invent the idea of a chief information security officer, Steve Katz at Citibank in 1995. We had to invent the idea of an information sharing and analysis center in 1998, 1999. We had to invent the idea of a kill chain, right? We have there's the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? That's just an idea. It's pretty much free, and yet it's been able to transform the way that we've been able to do defense. And so we do tend to underestimate those operational, those process innovations.
Window, then to Jonathan.
I'm going to add to that a little bit because we do have that widget. That widget is widespread. It's widely available. Everyone's already trained on it, and we can deploy it instantly, and that is delete. If you are
Delete?
Delete. It is delete, and it's available on every system that you use and every code base that you've got available to you. Yes, you can reduce the attack surface dramatically by getting rid of functionality that no longer serves your business needs. And doing that work to say, like, do we still need this, is a lot easier than trying to secure that mechanism that nobody's looking at. So deciding that that this is no longer critical functionality and that we're going to reduce our attack surface by eliminating this, whatever this is. This could be a service, this could be a server, this could be an entire code base, this could be a legacy platform in your environment, this could be a feature that nobody is using. It's the easiest thing you could possibly do because the vulnerabilities that are in that code, on that server, in that service, are not going to impact your environment if you do not deploy it, if you have deleted it. So I would say delete is that magical widget and that organizational structure that you're talking
and
about.
delete data, right? You don't have to worry about a breach for data that you're no longer.
No, we like
no
data.
longer
We
holding.
want the data.
Yeah.
No,
I don't want to delete it.
no, data's liability. Get rid of it. You don't need it.
Jonathan?
I definitely want a lot more data.
What data? What kind of data do you want?
Okay, well, so I just to go on some of Jay's points because I think that those go into the more data. We were able to start looking more into systemic risk and to discover potential companies which pose a systemic risk by using SEC disclosures. Mm-hmm. And so we're going into the weeds of the accounting standards, 131 for those who care, and basically those are meant for companies to disclose relationships with other companies that they have, which might pose a significant risk. In my view, they're a little bit outdated, right? While we got a lot of data out of them, they are really thinking about those business relationships, which could pose a large risk, which are themselves large relationships. So if you have a significant supplier that, if they stop delivering you with some raw materials and you're going to have a shutdown, then, okay, cool, you need to disclose that on your annual filings, your investors can know, policymakers can know, and then we can start understanding where systemic risk might be. With cyber, this is really out of date. I think that a lot of it can be a very small contract, which can pose a very large risk. If they have trusted access, privileged access, then that's something which should also be disclosed using the existing mechanisms. This doesn't need a cyber Dodd-Frank, although I think we should get there. But I think it doesn't need that for this point, where you can use the existing mechanisms to get a lot more of the information that we would need. And this is not full SBOM, but a part of the way there of telling you what key inputs are that could pose a systemic risk.
And I'd really like to foot stomp, especially for the government folks, when we want to so understand what happens with supply chain, and we're like, oh, we should regulate, we do X, Y, and Z. I've never heard of accounting standards and just some small changes to accounting standards to help us understand full supply chains. It's such a small change to an existing regulation, and I think it's just a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and the SEC has it. The SEC provides this data through their EDGAR system. It's something that we could run with actively with a small change in rules.
The only thing more riveting than accounting standards is insurance. So I want to talk about insurance. Why can't we just insure against these risks? If Amazon Web Services goes down and half the Fortune 500 goes down, well, they have insurance contracts, right? Why is that not the obvious free market solution here? Let's start with you, Jonathan.
Correlated risk?
What is that?
The fact that so many different companies in their insurance portfolio that they're insuring with all software losses at the exact same time, given a large AWS outage.
Are they ready for that?
I'm not going to speak for them. I have doubts.
I'd say for the consumers that have their information compromised when a service has been negligent in their duty to protect that information, that credit monitoring service isn't going to help them mitigate their risk of identity theft.
When I got to the White House in 2003, we were going to do insurance, and other risk transfer mechanisms are the way that it's going to happen. 18 years on, and insurance just has not, as great as the idea is, it has just not been able to bear the public policy weight that we're expecting for insurance. So hopefully we're going to get there. I think ransomware has really changed things up, and hopefully it can do better.
Last question before we wrap. What is, to you, your nightmare scenario when we think of a systemic shock? And then we're gonna go straight into Jay's point on how we can innovate in the cybersecurity field specifically.
That's ugly. I don't know. Who wants to take this first?
Critical vulnerability in a device that doesn't have an update mechanism.
That meant that billions of people.
That impacts lots of folks, whether it's a car, it's an airplane, it's an MRI device. Like, that's my nightmare scenario. Critical vulnerability being exploited in devices that don't have update mechanisms.
Jay?
Yeah, we're not treating the internet sustainably, to borrow the language from the environmental movement. Like our grandkids and their grandkids, there's no way they're going to have an internet that is as good as the one that we have today. I'm scared that the advantage that the defender has had at the system-wide is going to go from them having the advantage to them having supremacy, right? Things can get a lot worse.
Okay, I'll add to it. There are things that we understand widely that are really critical: financial services, energy sector. If somebody came up with a clever way of getting into them, for example, to disrupt trades, and nobody notices it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it'd be a huge disaster.
Great. Well, on that cheery note, we're going to move on to the next panel. Vivian, back to you.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Jonathan, Window, Jay. You definitely made good on the title of that session, which was Monsters Under the Bed. So now that we are suitably scared, we're going to turn to our next session, which is going to really talk about how we slay those monsters. This is where the dragons come back in. That's the theme for the Cyber Summit, is dragons. How can the cybersecurity industry address the systemic risks that we've been talking about? Please welcome to the stage Ang Kui, the CEO of Red Balloon Security, Sam King, the CEO of Veracode, and Wael Mohammed, the CEO of Forescout. Moderating this discussion is Michael Daniel, founder and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Vivian, for that introduction. And I think we've had a great talk by Jen Easterly with Kelly Boren this morning, and the previous panel talking about the nature of systemic risk and how it has evolved and what it's like. And I think from our purposes, this panel, we're going to focus on what the cybersecurity industry can and should be doing about systemic risk. But first, let me just kind of open with a question about how do you think about systemic risk, and importantly, why should organizational leaders, maybe those who aren't even in charge of giant pieces of the infrastructure, why should they care about this topic of systemic risk? So,
you want to go, Sam?
Sure, I'll jump in here. So. The way I think about systemic risk actually resonates quite a bit with what the previous panel was talking about. But from an organizational perspective, I think the biggest shift that I've seen is historically we've talked about protecting our critical assets. And a lot of times organizations will identify what are the applications or systems that are really critical. And I think when you think about this problem space through the lens of systemic risk, you realize that there's really only one asset that is critical, and that is the mission of whatever your organization is setting out to do. And increasingly, that mission is dependent on other parties. So when you think about getting speed and agility in your business, you automatically think about driving digital transformation. And the last 18 months in particular have hastened digital transformation at a pace that I think was unimaginable prior to this. People that were sitting on the fence and saying, our business is not ready, our users are not ready, our patients are not ready, our students are not ready, got ready, and got ready overnight. And a lot of that adoption of new technology, hastening of digital transformation, oftentimes was conducted by making use of third-party service providers, by making use of third-party software, open source code, commercial code, et cetera. So when you think about this problem from the standpoint of systemic risk, you realize that the critical asset is the mission of your business. That mission is being fueled by digital transformation, and digital transformation in turn is being fueled by this great reliance and dependency on all of these service providers, which makes good business sense. It helps you go faster, but it introduces that risk into your system. And I think the reason why leaders and organizations, even those that don't have responsibility for the infrastructure or even security, the reason why they should care about this is that when they look forward, their ability to drive the business results and their ability to manage risk for their business is increasingly dependent on this environment and the broader ecosystem.
Yeah.
So, man, all right. I have some thoughts on systemic risk on the commercial side, but also, for the U.S. government within defense. And I'll preface this by saying, I've spent the last 15 years of my life thinking about security for computers that pretty much no one wants to think about, and those are the ones that you don't see, right? The little embedded computers that run all of the critical infrastructure. And actually, this is a great room, right? If I asked everyone to draw on a piece of paper what you think a fault protection relay in a substation looks like, I think we're going to get at least a dozen different, things, right? But so I was coming up, so we drove from Denver to Aspen, great trip yesterday, like 11 o'clock at night. And I was thinking about this. We're talking about how innovation can solve or help, make systemic risk go away. And I started thinking, well, you know what? Innovation, by definition, actually generates systemic risk, because one of the things that, during innovation, what you do is you take a thing that might not be possible, right, and you create a thing that's functional, but you, by necessity, have to hopefully, ignore some of the externalities, right? And then the next iteration of innovation will come in and say, ooh, how do we solve those externalities to make things a little bit better? And that innovation creates more externalities. And I think a good example of that, way back, we're not just talking about, cybersecurity. I was talking to Manju, my colleague, in the car. Does anybody remember this thing called Operation Plowshare? Show of hands, anyone? So this was like in the 1960s, right? I think we had two problems. And it was right around here in the Rockies and Santa Fe, New Mexico. The two problems were we had too many mountains and we had too many nuclear weapons that we didn't know what to do with. So Operation Plowshare was this series of innovative experiments to see if we can use one to solve the other by blowing up large chunks of the mountain. We also, I think at some point, wanted to create the Pan-Atomic Canal by just blowing up the Panama Canal and expanding it. Right, so that's innovation, right? The externality is that, we knew that there was going to be some radioactivity that's going to be left in the land, but that's one of those externalities, right? The next round of innovators will come in and solve. And I think we see that. I mean, that's the thing that I see in innovation in cybersecurity, both for defensive capability, right, for all these things, and also by definition, offensive capabilities too. And to make things worse, right, radioactivity, nuclear fallout is not an intelligent adversary. Right? It just does radio decay. So if you put the adversary, like an intelligent adversary, into this mix, who also innovates, right, potentially against you, then I see that, there's no way to not innovate, but by going forward, we're necessarily increasing, accelerating both, right, the problem and the solution, and it's really interesting to think about. I don't know if that's kind of a bummer for this early in the morning, but that was my thought coming up here.
From my perspective is basically, I heard it in the previous panel, Wendell mentioned about not only your customers, but your customers' customers and your customers' customers' customers. And long time ago, we used to talk about basically how the perimeter is disappearing. Today, it disappeared. As a matter of fact, now in the time of COVID, we're all working from home, and it's real. I do still remember how I started my first company, and I was standing in the lineup to actually pay for my grocery, and then the cashier said, you know what, at only cash, we cannot really take any credit or any plastic. And I said, okay, I'll go to the ATM in the machine and put my card, and it still did not really work. And then I had to leave my grocery, and I realized there was something wrong with the system. And as I get my car and I was low on gas, I stopped the fuel, and thanks God, actually the card worked. But at that moment, I still remember, I said, you know what? That server that actually, it was a kill chain. It was a bank that basically had a problem with their firewall, and a part of the kill chain was very dramatic. They actually stopped the system. So all their customers were affected. And I said, you know what, that server needs to be able to protect itself. Doesn't matter where it lives. If it's living in this parking lot, it should be able to protect itself. And that was actually at a beginning of reimagining how it's gonna work. And that's what innovation is all about. When I started, it was like maybe 100 companies basically tried to be able to solve problems. Today, there's thousands. When I started, there was not a lot of resources, there was not a lot of money. You had to go and talk to a lot of VCs to convince them that cybersecurity is important. Today, there's funds that are dedicated only to cybersecurity. So I want to bring some positive into this. I do believe we have incredible amount of innovation in our space. Every single day, I talk to new entrepreneurs with ideas to solving problems we as a large companies do not see. And that's the beauty about basically innovation, is to reimagine things that we don't see or think even is important today. And that's the only way we can get ahead, because the bad guys are cooperating and collaborating and basically sharing. And they're learning and investigating what we have. And you mentioned earlier, we were talking outside about how the information is available to everybody. And we as an industry need to actually embrace that innovation and basically continue with it. But I do believe we made huge progress in the last 30 years I've been in the industry. Now we know what cybersecurity is, we understand the risk, we understand it's not inside our walls. Now even our own employees that working from home bringing a completely new set of risks that was not as visible 2 years ago. Now it's visible. We're talking about privacy, and you have no idea when you're talking on Zoom what's listening, what basically microphone is on. You have smart everything in your house. And now your house is part of your enterprise. So it's incredible, basically new setting. I do believe cybersecurity, it is like the brakes on the car. It's not invented to make cars go slower. It made cars to go faster. Can you imagine if you're driving on the highway 100 miles an hour without no brakes? You can't. So we as cybersecurity leaders, we need to figure ways in how to actually do exactly what you said, allow organization to drive growth and digitize and take a full advantage of what we have, but in a safe manner. And the only way for that is we need to understand the risk and be able to mitigate it in various ways, whether that to do with your basically how you write code, whether that basically understanding some of the vulnerability in your hidden system, and whether that basically to be able to segment certain assets so it will not be as exposed. There's many, many ways to be able to do that, and I think our industry have a lot of leaders, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so actually I want to build on that point. While the security industry, as you noted, it's notoriously fractured, right? I mean, if you go to any sort of large cybersecurity conference like RSA or something like that, I mean, there are thousands of security vendors there. And it's a very intensely competitive industry. In fact, it's nice that all of you are sitting on stage being so nice to each other, and we appreciate that. But how does this, this structure, this very diversified, fractured nature of the cybersecurity industry, how does that affect the industry's ability to identify and address systemic risk? Especially since if you think about most companies start out being, they are designed to solve a problem. Right? There's a cybersecurity problem, and they build a widget or a process or a thing to solve that problem. How should we think about that? Maybe we can start with you.
So here's a thought. Well, maybe another way to think about this problem is if you look at the number of dollars or cybersecurity companies that are built and operating to solve the problems that they solve, right? And you put that on a histogram or some sort of a heat map. Does that mean that those things that are hot are the biggest security problems that we should address, right? And I personally don't think so, and I think there are plenty of reasons why that is. I think it is true. Lots of security companies out there, lots of competition. I think there's certainly some risks that probably have an overabundance of solutions and commercial companies that can help and make those products. And I think there's certainly some of the more critical infrastructure things that in my mind represents one of the larger sort of cyber systemic risks that is really interestingly underserved. And this is what I did my PhD on at Columbia, and this is kind of what my company does to address. I think there's a really interesting dynamic. Maybe we can, if we have time, let's come back to, right? For example, the devices that make up the critical infrastructure, right? Do the people that operate and use those devices, right, have any impact on how secure that device is? And if there's a compromise, who pays, right? Does the manufacturer who makes this thing pay money, or is it all on, let's say, the operator? And one of my analogies is, and I know Windows here, all right? So I would say, so close your eyes. Imagine, you want to run a utility, right? You make power, you have a hydro dam, and the world says, okay, the computer that controls all of your valves and things that can catch on fire and explode and take power out, okay, the best on the market is you buy a Windows XP pre-patched laptop, okay? You can't open it up, you can't look at the code, you can't install anything. You connect it to your network and you automate all this stuff, right? And you have to have an audit process. And that's how you can't, reverse engineer the thing. You can't get Microsoft to do anything, and Windows not around, so no service pack 1, right? Pre-patch. And then, lo and behold, right, like the utility gets compromised because, in 2021, if you're running a Windows unpatched XP laptop, you're gonna get owned in like half a minute. And then what happens is the utility has the responsibility of doing all of the forensic information, the cleanup, and the reporting, right? While the manufacturer that made the Windows XP laptop keeps on making Windows XP things. And when I've surveyed the different devices that run these critical infrastructures, yeah, I would say some verticals are different, but certainly in power and industrial control, I would say the average security posture for the code inside those things is like circa 2001 to 2005. So I think the big question is, well, why do we have that dynamic? And I think if we can solve that dynamic, we can really kind of get to the heart of addressing that thread, right?
Yeah, so Sam?
So first thing I'll say is thank you for acknowledging us being really nice to each other, despite the fact that we compete in the cybersecurity market. I would say that being competitive and being civil are not mutually exclusive. So I think we can all do that. So I've been in the security industry for over 20 years at this point in time, and there has absolutely been an immense explosion of service providers in this space and an immense expansion of the understanding of what we do. When I first started, my parents didn't quite understand what I do for a living. Then they got to a point where they were really proud of what I did for a living. And lately, they're at a point where they're looking at me and saying, are you really good at your job or not? Because it's like,
I've gotten the same question.
What are you guys doing, right? And I said, I don't know, I'm going to the Aspen Cyber Security Summit and I'll come back and report to you. So, here's how I would talk about the characteristics of the security market. It is intensely competitive, and there is some positive that comes from it, and there's some risk that gets created as a result of that. The positive that comes from it is that you cannot be complacent as a service provider. The people whose needs we are serving are thoughtful, discerning, technical buyers that really care about solving the cybersecurity problem for their organization, right? And with the intense competition that exists, you constantly have to be on your toes. You have to be continually innovating. You cannot stand still, because if you do, then someone else is going to come in. The cycle with which the next generation of the next generation of the next generation technology comes out is really shrinking. So from that perspective, competition is a good thing because it keeps us all very motivated to continually innovate. and to try to address the problem in such a way that you're not just providing a feature or a capability to solve some very narrow aspect of the problem, that you're really trying to get at the business value associated with the cybersecurity problem that you're tackling. So I think that's one of the positives that comes from this. I also think that because of the relatively easy and tremendous access to capital, there's this equalizing of the playing field between the large players and the smaller players. You can have a startup that has a brilliant idea. Perhaps it's getting at systemic risk, perhaps it's getting at a particular very specific problem, but either ways, they can get access to capital, they can go spin up their technology inside a cloud service provider, and next thing you know, they're competing with a very large organization. So that equalizing of the playing field, I think, also keeps us all thinking about how do you solve this problem in a better, more holistic way. Now, some of the negative that can come from that is that sometimes in this need to constantly differentiate and to have your message be heard above the noise that exists in the sector, you may chase after some bells and whistles, some features that look really cool, but when you're really thinking about the broad landscape of the business problem that somebody is dealing with, maybe you're not going to have that much of an impact. And I think that is where I will channel what Director Easterly was talking about in her opening remarks. That's where the partnership aspect between those of us that are service providers in this industry and those that are trying to solve the cybersecurity problem at the front lines inside organizations, whether they be in the public sector or the private sector, comes into the picture. Because if we are held accountable to not producing the coolest feature, but if we're held accountable to how are we actually helping them reduce the risk, prevent, or those of us that are on the detect response side do that in a better, more holistic way, then that helps raise the game for everybody.
I totally agree. I believe, look, the real competition here is the bad guys, and that's the reality. Yes, we can be able to compete or co-opete basically on some projects or trying to be able to win. We're in the end of the day in business of actually doing business and adding value to our customers, and can be able to take that value that we add and we can reinvest and innovate and so forth. But new companies always keep us on our toes because they always look at something that is very, very small. Maybe it's not in our radar because of our size, of our basic priorities, and they can be able to reimagine something that will become important tomorrow. I believe innovation is about time, and bigger companies have resources, have money, but the only thing we don't have is time, especially in our space. Like, if you are in a hardware space, you have a different cycle than a software space. In a cybersecurity space, we're dealing in the seconds. And we always have to react. And when you always have to react, you basically, you have to have a different DNA. And I do believe there is always going to be room for innovation. When I have one of my customers, because there is no silver bullets, and when you go to the customer, any one of us, do not go to the customer and say, by the way, I can solve all your problems. That's not true. This is what I can solve very well. This is what I'm very good at, and basically, and be able to provide that. And we know we have to be able to work together. And when the customer is down, we forget we're competing. We basically have to figure out how to bring this customer up. And in my industry for many years, we always picked up the phone and called to each other and said, hey, this customer is down, how can we be able to collaborate? Organization like yourself is actually encourage us to have a platform for sharing. It's important. As you mentioned, information becoming stale very quickly. In the old days, if you have something that is basically of importance and you hold it for a month, you feel that you have something valuable. Now it's like 24 hours, it's already been known. So how to deal with that? One of the things that actually wake me up at night is the stealth attacks. We hear all the stuff in the news. By the time you hear about it, it's basically either it's not sophisticated or it's already happened. But good thieves do not break a window, do not leave any things on the carpet. They do not tell you that you are actually in the house. You are in and out. And there is basically those attacks that you are already in, and we don't know for months. You know what I mean? It's extremely dangerous. One of the things we've done better than a lot of other countries is disclosures. Like, we hear a lot of attacks happening because we have an obligation to disclose, and we have really perfected how we can be able to deal with that and strike this balance between how you disclose and not basically providing the information to the bad guys. But there is a lot of countries that are behind that. And I can assure you, there's tons of attacks happening that we see every day that it basically in a lot of places around the world that it's not disclosed. And disclosure is very important because that's how you can be able to mitigate the risk. If the bad guys know that they're going to get caught and their techniques has been basically been captured and we understand it and we can have the right IOCs and can be able to do the sharing, we can close that window. There's tons we need to be able to do, but I'm very optimistic that we're getting way better in basically perfecting the disclosures.
Yeah, it's great.
Well,
No, go ahead.
I have a thing. It's very optimistic. So I like it. So, you know, in response to the thing you said about, you know, the bad guys are our biggest problems. You know, well, that's probably true, right? But if we look at not just the cybersecurity industry, let's just think about tech industry as a whole. I think the tech industry is the tech industry's biggest systemic risk. And I'll give you an example, right? In two directions. So, you know, the more obvious one is we love making new things with, frivolous, functionality, right? Or maybe, in retrospect, not the most prudent things to put on things. And I was
Cat filters, perhaps?
Cat filters are, I think, good for the world. It'll be probably, that's the thing that's going to save democracy. But, right, so one example, I was looking at a brand new fault protection relay, right, and these are the things that is the first line of defense for, substation power grid. If there's a line down, overcurrent, right, this thing is a computer that disconnects so power lines don't burn and, things don't catch on fire. Right? And I'm sure we've all heard, the first thing we should do, right, is enforce air gap in this network. And everybody says, like, air gap is the first thing you got to do. And this is a brand new 2021 product. And they say that in the manual, but on the side of the physical box, they have a Google Play and an Apple App Store logo. And I said, what does that mean? And you scan the QR code. The thing is, you can control it, right, from your iPhone. And this is not like a commercial, right, fault protection relay. I mean, no, this is the thing that actually is about to get rolled into our critical infrastructure right now. So in this case, right, tech industry loves to put all of this new ways of access, and a lot of times I think we kind of run before we really think about whether we should, the whole run fast and break things, cool for Facebook, right, but maybe not the greatest for critical infrastructure things. And the bad guys, sure, they're there. Their job is to take advantage of the vulnerabilities of the things that we build. So so that's one part of it. And the other part, simultaneously, right, the tech industry also has a way of not getting rid of the really old legacy things. So we're suffering from both problems at the same time. It's almost paradoxical, but right, we have too many things that are way too old, that have no security, and we keep on building really new things that have all sorts of connectivity and very little security. So, yeah.
But I think this actually raises an interesting point that really has struck me over the years as I have been involved with cybersecurity, that so much of the challenges that we're talking about here are as much about the economics of the problem as they are about the technology of the problem. So why do we have all of those legacy systems still hanging around? That's about economics, right? Yeah. It's because it's more economical in many ways to keep those systems around, right? Why don't companies patch when they know that they should? I mean, it's not because they're stupid, right? It's because it just doesn't make it up on the mission priority list, right? It's about the economics. And even when Window was talking about the economics of the devices, right, on the previous panel, right? Why are the devices run that slim with as few protections put in? It's as much about economics as it is about the technology. And so I'm really interested in your thinking about sort of how the economics of the network effects, right, of there's an advantage to having everybody on the same platform or using the same software, right? That's, there's an advantage to that. But that creates a single point of failure. It helps create this systemic risk. And so how should we think about the economics of this, particularly, like the security, from the security industry's point of view? How should we think about the economics of that, and how does that affect what solutions are available for managing systemic risk? Well, we can start with you.
A great point. And just to to kind of comment on the optimism about where we are and your point of introducing a lot of risk because of the innovation on the technology side. I think there is a little bit of balance. I believe the economics is actually moving in the right direction. So let me give you an example. Many years ago, the CFO will basically say, you need to have basically a business case why you need to have a virtual machine because our standard is physical. And then a few years later, they changed their mind and they said, look, if you don't put it in a virtual machine, because they realize it's safer and economically actually prudent, you need to give me a reason why you still need to have a physical server. And then now, if you actually do not use cloud, they can basically have to make a justification why you need to basically have a different architecture. So the infrastructure change has moving extremely fast. It's more cost effective than forcing all this legacy to be able to move forward. And at a pace that it never happened before. So as a security leaders, we need to be able to realize the world is changing. And there's many, many changes. First, the infrastructure change. You know, I mean, when I started my company, I thought I was going to do server security, and then it became virtual security, and then became cloud security, and now we're saying serverless. Can you imagine? When I sat down at my kitchen table building my business plan, there was no imagination to reimagine a serverless. You know what I mean? And now we're talking about DevOps and the speed and how to be able to develop. But there's always behavior, user behavior risk. Now, when people are going to come back from to basically post-COVID, there's a new hybrid world when working from home is a reality. There's a huge organization were designed, you have to be from the inside. And now you need to be able to figure out this new behavior, and we need to adjust to that. And it's happening at the pace that we would never anticipate. It would probably, if it was not for COVID, would have taken us 15 years. Now we're going to take us months, and you saw how many organizations spun out their organization very quickly. The third and the most difficult thing for us is the change of the motivation of the hackers. And a ransomware is not a new thing. It existed. But they used to go to your PC and capture some pictures and try to be able to say, can you pay me this so I can give you your information back? And now they can be able to go to a pipeline and it can turn on very mission-critical systems. It's an old techniques. It's just basically used in a new way. So to go back to you, I think the economics work into our advantage. And you'll find that we're going to be moving to the new system faster. And we, as an industry, we need to accept that. We need to accept that it's cheaper to move to the new system. But here's a big risk. I cannot buy anything that's not smart. I cannot buy an old TV. I cannot buy an old fridge, whether I like it or not. And now I need to know in a hospital system, if this fridge is from my lunch or it's for the blood. And the risk is totally different. And now I need to look at it as not just a fridge. You know what I mean? What it does and where it is and how it's going to be sitting in the network and how I'm going to deal with it. And this is things we're going to need to completely revisit the way we actually look at risk, not only internally and externally, but even internally. And I heard in the previous panel talking about as simple as a printer. You know what I mean? A printer is a mission-critical system because it actually takes a huge amount of data that you can send. You can send a contract, you can send very confidential information. And a simple hijacking of that printer that it looks like a very low-level device can become very, very dangerous. Or a camera, or a thermometer, and it's just a new world. So economically, I think things are improving because it's getting cheaper. It adds more challenge on us because we need to really innovate faster. But here's the beauty. As I hear you talk, I'm very proud of our industry to be able to attract that smart people to our industry, to be able to think about these problems. And there's tons of problems to be solved. And our competition, the bad guys, they come from a different education backgrounds. Diversity is going to be very important. Our number one challenge right now is talent. How we can be able to draw a diverse talent. We have huge shortage. And we need to figure out how we can be able to attract them and make them on the right side. There is a lot of money to be made on the wrong side.
Yep.
And I think the partnership between government and industry is going to be a big, big factor of that.
Okay. Yeah, Sam.
So I think there's a lot embedded within this question around the economics as they relate to the network effects of using certain service providers or software platforms and so forth. Let me try to address it from a few different perspectives. So first of all, I think the question of economics lands very differently when you're talking about the economics from the attacker perspective versus the economics from the defender perspective, right? For
Yep.
attackers, relatively low cost, very high returns, very high profitable, big business, right? From the defender's point of view, with respect to continued use of old technologies, and I think it is a great point that you made about we see simultaneously tremendous use of old and tremendous adoption of new, and then probably everything in between, right? So we don't all move consistently to the new, so you have these vulnerabilities that were present in old systems that are latent, and then as digital transformation has been occurring and systems have been getting connected at a faster pace, now that vulnerability is no longer latent, right? Someone can take advantage of that. But when you think about the economics, you can certainly talk about how, it's cheaper for me to just stay with the old and not go to the new till that's no longer true. But because all of a sudden, on a particular day, you can't find the talent to keep up the old stuff, speaking to your point, Wael, it becomes more expensive to make changes on the old stuff. A lot of the migration to the cloud, a lot of digital transformation, you hear people talking about taking their monolith and either breaking it apart into microservices, or sometimes because they don't want to undertake that effort because they think it might be too expensive, they're taking the monolith and migrating the monoliths to the cloud and then building cloud services around it. But you're carrying some of that cost and you're carrying some of that technical debt with you. It also behooves us to look at some aspects of the economics that have been known for quite some time, but taking better action on them. So I think NIST has published this data forever, which is it is 30 times more expensive to fix a problem once that application system gets in production versus doing it when you're actually developing it. So if you know that, then why do you not do it while you're developing it? That's where the time pressures of getting new functionality to the market come into the picture, right? Because if you're a business, you got two problems, growth and all the other problems, right? And how you're going to drive growth is you're going to drive growth by creating new experiences, by attracting your customers, whoever they may be, to your products and offerings versus your competitors. Increasingly, you're going to do that by creating these new, amazing, sticky digital experiences. You're going to do that by getting great functionality out to market sooner, right? So then that's where you get this juxtaposition of speed to market, driving revenue, building it more securely, doing it right. I know it's cheaper to do it right here than doing it later, but I might rush and get code out, which a lot of people actually say that they will oftentimes ship code with vulnerabilities present in it, right? So I think those are the factors that we have to take into consideration. And there have been some moves within technology, talking to, holding technology accountable to creating secure technology. DevOps is a movement that's changing up how software development gets done. DevOps very quickly turned into DevSecOps, and I would argue that in doing so, took into account that economic model if it's cheaper to fix it sooner than doing it later. So there are opportunities present, too, in this migration from the old to the new.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that strikes me is that this is also a space then that the government has to think about how it might want to be involved and shape the market, right? And are there ways that it can help address some of that, first to market wins, second to market dead, right? So that, there's pressure to not deal with the security questions, right? And there are places where we might want to say, we actually want to slow that down as a society, as a digital ecosystem. We want to actually slow that down a little bit to give us the time to think these things through and to bake in the security from the beginning. Ang, I'll turn to you in just 1 second on this question, but we were talking previously about how this affects the federal government too. Many people complain about the old technology you see in the federal government, but that's not because the federal government is just bureaucratic and slow entirely. It is incredibly easier to get money from Congress to keep old systems running than it is to get money to buy new systems. So if you're a federal manager, or if you're an expert, or someone in the federal government responsible for running an IT system, it is eminently practical and logical to keep the old system running because you can get money for that, and you cannot get money to buy a new thing. So of course that's what you're going to do. So I think that's those economic and structural issues are ones that's very important for the security industry to think about as we look to how we shape innovation to deal with the systemic risk problems. But Ang, I'll let you sort of weigh in on some of these.
Man, lots of things to say. So the first thing is, well, one, on the optimism thing, I think for security people, fundamentally, we have to simultaneously be, a pessimist because we think there are problems that needs to be fixed, and optimist because we think we might be able to actually fix some of these problems. And in terms of, the network effect, right, and having mass adoption of a single system, does that actually, improve security, make security worse? I think all of the things we've been saying here largely applies, I think, to general purpose computing, right? If you want to do a cloud, right, you can do a lot of really good things to improve security across the board. Looking at critical infrastructure things, though, I think the dynamics are very much different. You don't have the same dynamic where you can just replace all of your Cisco routers on the internet, right? You can't switch out, every fault protection relay. I'm sure people would like to sell you new fault protection relays, but I'm here to say I would put a whole lot of money on that will never really happen, right? We're going to be living in this, perpetual legacy security problem forever, or just going forward, unless, it all burns down and we have to rebuild again, which won't happen. And in terms of, the security versus the, mass adoption or network effect thing, I do think that that's actually a false choice, or, that's not a real connection, at least in critical infrastructure things. Because, well, number one, right, it's not true that if you have the same device, that device can't use technology to, intentionally have diversity and actually prevent, exploitation of it, right? You can have one, lineage of technology that actually is more secure than 50 different ones. And in this country, if you look at critical infrastructure, we already have the network effect, right? So if you look inside, let's say any power station, right, there's one vendor that roughly has what, like 75% of this country's, power distribution market. And if you look at PLCs, not that many companies make PLCs, right? There's effectively 3 or 4 major players. The players shift from the US to, the rest of the world. But yeah, we have, very few major players that have these entrenched products that don't change very much. And sometimes they change a lot by putting a Bluetooth chip on, and you really have to ask why. And yeah, so finally, in terms of the economics of, the security, right, like how to change security for critical infrastructure, I would say I do see that fundamentally there's a misalignment on incentive between the people who manufacture devices that go into critical infrastructure, right, and how much security they built in, and the incentive of the market demanding additional security, because again, the people who make this stuff do not actually, have to pay very much when the operators are compromised with the products, right, that they make, because the operators have to pay for the cleanup. And I think if we can address that misalignment of incentive, then we can really get at the heart of that problem. But we're not really going to be able to until we start really looking at that policy end.
Excellent. So we've got about slightly less than 5 minutes left in the discussion, and so I'm going to end with this question on what's one action an organizational leader could take in the short term to try to better safeguard themselves against the systemic risk that we've been talking about this morning. So Sam, why don't we start with you?
So I think it starts with visibility, right? If you are a single organization, you are dependent on technologies, you're dependent on software and code, some of which you've written, some of which you're getting from third parties. I think asking your organization to first and foremost have an understanding of what do we use? What versions of things do we use? Where do we have some concentrated risk because we're using a third-party supplier, perhaps for multiple business units or what have you? That visibility starts to create the ability to take action. It starts to create better vigilance around what new vulnerabilities have been discovered with these technologies that we're using. And if you know where you're using them, then you can immediately shift your effort and attention to reacting to that and patching it versus going out and figuring out where am I using that version of OpenSSL when Heartbleed came out, as an example, right? So much of the energy at first was just spent on discovering. So I think if we can create visibility around what is it that we're using, and then this is where, going to your previous question around the role of the federal government, this is where aggregating some of that information in an anonymized fashion across multiple organizations can start to give you a sense for where's their concentrated risk when you think about the ecosystem more broadly, right? And so I think if there's one area that I would ask people to focus their attention on, it is getting visibility into what you are using. And we have published a report called the State of Software Security Report, where we provide visibility into the use of open source. What open source is most prevalent? Which one is on the rise? Which is on the decline? So also making use of those kinds of sources to get smarter on what you have so that you're in a better position to defend and to respond when new vulnerabilities or new issues invariably arise.
Excellent. On?
Man,
one thing they
okay,
can do.
one thing. Okay, I would say I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, again, critical infrastructure things. So if you're a user of these devices, you run some type of critical infrastructure, be it in government or in the commercial space. I would say very much like what you said. Knowing what's bad in the firmware of the things, right, is step number one. And I think software, SBOM, good idea. It's just the start. But if you don't have, the real no BS answer to what is actually in the firmware and how bad the security is or how good it is, you can't really start making decisions on, well, which PLC is actually more secure than the other. And then, on the same, in that same sentence, I'll say, once you have that information, go and complain, right? Complain to, the federal regulators, go and complain to the device manufacturers. And, we need to start, holding those folks' feet to the fire to say, it's probably not okay to ship an operating system you compiled back in 2005 in a product you're selling in 2021, right? But you can't say that unless you actually know that fact. So find out some facts and go complain.
An SBOM, a very good acronym, software bill of materials, just to unpack that a little bit. But I agree. And Wael, we'll give you the last word here.
I do agree. Visibility is very important. You cannot really protect what you don't really know, and you need to understanding, and SBOM will be definitely very important, so you can be able to know if this component is really, do you have it or not, and if you do have it, what are you going to do about it? If I have one thing to be able to as an advice to any customer, I always say, ask yourself a question: are you currently under attack or not? And if you are, do you have all the right mechanisms so you can be able to react? And if you're not, do you really know exactly how you can be able to deal with it when you do? I remember one industry colleague told me when their peer, another competitive basically organization, got hacked, his CEO called him and he says, why we're not hacked? Because he said, look, let me assume that basically we're not better than them. And if they got attacked, then we could be attacked. I need to understand where we stand. And that's going back to visibility. And I think the most important thing as an industry leaders, to be able to provide visibility. How can I show you where you are, where you stand, and then best action, you can be able to do that economically.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the great discussion this morning. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we've actually set up the next panel, built on the previous discussions in the previous panel, and have set up the next panel quite nicely. So thank you for your time and participation this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great speaking with you.
Great. Thank you, Michael, so much for that great panel. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the cyber initiatives at the Aspen Institute, and I am here to introduce our next set of panelists. We will have a slight programming change due to the vagaries of actually hosting things in person. Paul Abate, the Deputy Director of the FBI, is running late today and not able to make it. But the good news is we already have one former Deputy Director of the FBI on stage today. So I'm welcoming back Kelly Bourne of the Hewlett Cyber Initiative, Sean Joyce, former Deputy Director of the FBI, now with PwC, Mika Yang, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy at the Pentagon, and Kevin Mandia of FireEye, one of the industry's leading thinkers and threat researchers. So thanks very much for continuing to stick with us today at the Aspen Cyber Summit. And Kelly, over to you.
Garrett, thank you. Yes, I'm back. Nice to see all of you today for this conversation about nation states and organized crime. I want to make this a little bit more of a conversation, so I have about a half dozen questions for you all, but then also really want to welcome you to ask questions of one another because it's such an interesting panel we've got here. But I think I want to start, Sean, with one for you. which is really how have you seen the landscape of cybercrime evolve over the last decade? It was about 10 years ago that you first started in 2011 as Deputy Director of the FBI. And what do you see as the front lines today?
So I'll do my best first to impersonate Paula Bate. But I really think the threat landscape, and we've heard, I think, from multiple folks this morning, that it is constantly evolving. And one thing that I think we all see is it's constantly changing. But I think when you look at the criminals, I think probably 20 years ago, to be sort of in the business, you had to be very technical. Right, and those were the people still, when you look at the Eastern European area where a lot of the prolific hackers emanated from, that was the thing. Now we've seen it really, them becoming, right, cybercrime as a service and proliferating their malware and their tools, so that you're seeing, those of you out there that are listening that are as old as I am, if you remember those old Nigerian scam letters, it has really just proliferated, I think, in the cyber realm. And when you look at, and then furthermore on the criminals, like the ransomware, it's almost like a gold rush. Like, where can we make money? And so, Michael mentioned in the previous panel about the economics. So I think we've seen a great change there and a rush to what I think a lot of companies are dealing with right now. On the nation state, I think it's about, really the barriers to entry are so low. So it's not like you have to have a standing army. It's not like you need a nuclear arsenal. You actually need a team of smart people that give them the ability to do things that many nation states were doing. So I think you're seeing a lot more nation states that typically we didn't see in that space come into that space, and that to me is concerning in itself.
And Kevin, Mika, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well from your respective perches of just how you've seen the landscape evolve in the time that you've been in this field.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? I think early on, the nation-state capability was really the thing that we worried about, because when a nation-state's able to put its resources towards developing significant disruptive capability, that was something that worries us from the national security perspective. But as we're talking about here, the ransomware as a service, it makes those disruptive tools available to a much wider range of people, and we're seeing increasingly fuzzy relationships between nation-state actors and criminals, and particularly worried about those nation-states that create a safe haven and a comfortable environment for the criminal actors to operate in. And that is something that we have to start addressing directly with those nations. But I think it is a real challenge because, as we all saw with Colonial, the criminal actor now has the ability to impose consequences on the average American as they go about their lives in a way that was unimaginable, I think, 10 years ago. And I think that's something that is part of the reason why I, as a defense official, am sitting here on this panel, because it's now at a nation-state threat level. And it's now at a national security threat level. That is something that we have to take on. We cannot just sort of sit back and protect our own networks and defend our way out of the situation. And you saw that in 2018, where the department said we have to be able to go outside of our networks and try and disrupt adversaries where they are. That was something that we did in response to the 2016 elections. But the criminal, especially the ransomware actors, have risen in priority for the Department of Defense in a way that we actually spend a fair amount of resources focusing on this threat.
Yeah, I think two changes I saw, and by the way, whenever you go last, you have to put the last breadcrumbs on the table. But the two changes that I think accelerated over the last few years is having an anonymous currency clearly enables bad guys, period. And so with the rise of the digital or the cryptocurrencies, I think we saw more lucrative and more anonymous criminal attacks. And then it was somewhere around 2016 or 2017, which means I was 5 years later than when it really happened. I noticed whoever's breaking in and whoever's doing the crime aren't even the same people anymore. So there was a time where doing the blocking and tackling to stop like 90% of the drive-by shootings on the information highway, that was good enough to stop the criminals because they were looking for the lowest hanging fruit. But now I think the criminal element is buying the access from folks that we're having a harder time putting in a bucket as to who they are. So we're responding to about 100 breaches, a little more than that right now. And on the criminal ones, I'm not sure whoever got initial access is the same person as who's actually conducting the crime. So that's a long-winded way of saying they might be getting better, and that there'll be a criminal element that's operating above the slop, the low-hanging fruit, as I called it. And for those folks that are trying to protect themselves, let's say from 99% of the threat actors instead of just 90% of the criminal, they'll do pretty good. But you're seeing the tools and tactics of the criminal element rising.
Kelly, I think an important question out of here, though, is why does it matter? Like the threat landscape, why does it matter
How
that
does
it's
it affect
changing?
the rest of us outside of
That's right,
government? Yeah.
and all those people in the companies listening, like there are a lot of people that say, well, it doesn't matter about attribution. And I would say, au contraire. Right, and to really understand the threat, and this is where I think you get into Director Easterly's statement about defense. Well, to understand defense and to play defense, you have to understand the risk, right? And right now, I don't think the government has the ability to understand the risk, and I don't think the private sector has the ability to understand the risk. And if you understand the risk, I think you're able to more effectively manage that risk, right? Like we're all keep saying cyber's a risk. The reason why it's so different is policymakers don't understand it, legislators don't understand it, and most business people don't understand it, right? So when we talk about this threat landscape changing, all those risk professionals out there and practitioners every day, they have to understand what does that mean to how they actually respond and mitigate, and unfortunately, as Kevin and I know all so well, recover, right? And actually learn from that. And I think that's where it's important on both sides to really say, okay, the threat landscape is changing, but what does that mean for us?
Well, and I think that relates to the next question I would ask, which is, as we're seeing these blurrier lines between nation-state adversaries and non-state actors, you've talked a little bit about attribution, but what are the real practical implications of this? Does that affect, for example, from the FBI's perspective, the ability to impose costs?
So impersonating my friend again, I don't think it does. I mean, we're seeing, all intelligence agencies around the world have used proxies as long as nation states have been spying. So I think what, going back to what Kevin was saying and Mika mentioned, it's these blurring of lines and being able to, I think, delineate and understand sort of who is doing what, so you can actually impose those costs and consequences. So this isn't just kind of a defensive play. You have to play a good defense, you have to actually know and understand the offense, and you can't be on defense all the time.
I would say since the start of the administration, we've seen a real increase in the focus on going after the criminal actor. DOJ and FBI have set up some new task forces to focus on this area. Our cooperation in the Defense Department with our law enforcement partners has really increased. And I think that you've seen, you saw this in the Lisa Monaco press conference about the Colonial Pipeline wallet seizure, the Rule 41, cleanup of the Microsoft web shells. You've seen the government thinking about much more creative use of its tools and authorities to try and help protect the American people, to try and impose additional costs on the adversary, all the way up to the President of the United States addressing his concerns about ransomware directly with a foreign head of state, which we've not seen before. And that's actually a big step of trying to address this through the entire spectrum of the relationship between the criminal and the nation-state actor, from the lowest level individual on keyboard who's in it for the profit, all the way up to trying to change the orientation of a nation-state about its, how it's going to do enforcement. So it's a much more cohesive approach to the problem, I think, than we've seen before. And I think that it's really trying to get at, what are the motivations of the people? This can't just be about securing our systems or going on offense about tools, but we have to think about how we impose costs on in a much more significant way. And this is really a whole of government effort that we've brought to bear here.
Thanks, Mika. Kevin, anything you want to add here, or Sean? Or I'd love to also move on to questions around harboring cyber criminals, but anything?
I guess might as well add something, even though I don't even think this addresses your question. You know, as I was thinking about it, I think we're all going to come up with, no nation likes ransomware. You know, and I think we can come up with rules of engagement that will apply to criminal elements, and you have countries that abide by those rules and say, these are crimes, we don't want to deal with it. And if you're a nation that harbors these folks and you don't impose consequence, you know, maybe we will. And, but I don't think we'll ever have rules of engagement for espionage because of the asymmetry and the fact that when you really sit down and think about it, it's just hard to come up with an arrangement where North Korea would say, yeah, okay, those are the rules we'll abide by. And the question just is, where's that line where national interests become criminal? But I think there is a large bucket of criminal activity that we can define, that you can have a bunch of nations aligned behind and impose a lot more consequence on. To either the people that conduct those crimes or to the nations that are harboring those folks and allowing them to do it. And ransomware, quite frankly, is probably the easiest one to define and go kill it with a whole international alliance and a lot of nations that want to just put it to bed over time.
You know, but I would add, Kevin, to what you're saying, like it's not just the government's actions. Right, so when we talk about the whole theme here of systemic risk, and we talked in several previous panels about critical infrastructure, 80 to 90% of the US critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. Okay, so to me, 80 to 90% of the intelligence should be coming from the private sector, right? And I think the private sector has a responsibility to do a much better job managing that risk, right? And there's such a disparity between some organizations that do a phenomenal job and maybe some that don't feel the need to invest so much. And then how do we change the paradigm with the government, right? So Jen mentioned, hey, one of the things that's still there with the government was bureaucracy. Right? How do we get rid of those jurisdictional lines? How do we get rid of this committee has oversight over this agency, so we're going to put authorities in this place? And how do we actually embed and integrate the private sector into these actions? Now, you see it with some of the ISPs out there and some of the companies that actually have done some takedowns, but I think that cooperation, that integration, going back, everyone's mentioned it, team sport, collaboration, all of that. I would say it's great to have informal relationships that we like each other. I think it has to be hardwired to work.
Yeah, I appreciated an op-ed I think you'd written in the Washington Post recently about this. Yeah. So moving on to nation states harboring cyber criminals, something we've seen a lot of. Would love to hear your thoughts on the implications of this. Is there a point at which this kind of assistance turns criminal operations into actually nation-state activity, and what does that mean for the kinds of authorities that can be brought to bear here?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really tough factual question, and it requires a fair amount of intelligence to be able to sort of figure out what the relationship state is between the nation-state and the criminal. And I really appreciate some research that Jay Healy had done on sort of this taxonomy of levels of state responsibility in this area. But one of the things that we try to that we model and try and encourage other nation states to do is that, we have seen in other countries that their nation state capability, those guys will like hack for the country by day and go home and hack for profit at night. And that's never something that we would allow in the United States. And if any defense employees are doing that, I think the FBI would like to have a word with you about it. But we have a sense of responsibility of our own forces. So we have highly capable people inside the Department of Defense, but they're not out there committing these kinds of attacks on other nations, where we see other nation states using that in a variety of environments. And then some other states who find advantage in allowing this sort of ecosystem to flourish, where there's sort of loose connections between the nation state and the criminal actors. And they may use them for access, they may use them for obfuscation, they may not have direct control in it, or they may, and so that's a very tough intelligence question to answer. But the bigger issue is, like, how do you get nation states to take responsibility for the threats that emanate from their territory? How do you say, look, you're either creating a permissive environment or you're directing attacks. Like, we need to have a conversation about this country to country, at least from the Defense Department. And meanwhile, right, the FBI and DOJ continue on their business of going about prosecuting the individuals. But it does become at some level a conversation between countries that we have to talk to them about, like, look, you really have to stop. You really have to get this under control. And you're starting to see those conversations happen now, not just from the US, but around the world. And you see that in a lot of the attribution statements that happened internationally on the Hafnium.
Hafnium was a great example of that kind of collaboration.
Yeah.
Anything either of you would add to that, or Sean, you have some?
I don't know why Kevin's pointing at me. I actually think we have started, and the government has initiated several groups to try to bring some of that collaboration. And as many of us know, right, it's a multi-pronged approach. So it's the State Department, it's the Department of Justice. I argue it's the private sector, right? It is a multiple. It's the Department of Treasury with sanctions, right? It is that multi-pronged approach to doing this, but we've got to establish those norms. And right now, I don't know if anyone up here knows, but I'm not aware of any norms in the cyber environment, right, that actually exists where we just say, no, that's a red line. That is not acceptable behavior, and you will suffer consequences for that behavior. And I think we're getting closer to do that. I think the UK has been a leader in that dimension. And, you know, folks, if you haven't read, the UK just came out with their national resilience strategy, and it actually is, I think, a great approach where they're looking at, hey, do you understand the risk? We already talked about that. Like, as a risk practitioner, we all need to understand what this risk truly encompasses. What are you doing to prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover? And then, as you know, Director Easterly mentioned previously, this is everybody's job, all the way down to the user. When she said, hey, if I could tell everyone to do one thing, MFA, I'm with you on doing the MFA, but it's everyone's job. And that is not the culture of the society we live in right now, right? It's the CISO's job, or it's CIS's job, or it's the FBI's job. No, it's all of our job. It's truly that team sport.
Yeah, I think if you go out a few years, everybody's going to figure out which countries harbor criminals or lack the technical infrastructure to pierce anonymity and impose risk or consequence to them. And you'll see different nations whose citizens have a whole different experience on the internet. I mean, when I look at all the remediation plans that, you know, PwC's written over the years and we've written over the years, over time, you're just blocking every IP address out of Russia. Then you're blocking every IP address from the service providers that the Russians use. And then you're blocking every IP address of the IP addresses. And granted, you're just putting your finger in the dike as it starts to leak. But we're going to get better at this no matter what. And for the countries that want to genuinely be part of a global economy, they're going to have to start imposing rules that meet the requirements of other nations. So I don't think it's going to get worse. I think it'll get better over time, and it's already happening naturally. There's already a whole different experience. I bet if all of us flew to Moscow right now and tried to access, I don't know, any defense industrial base company, you're not going to get there. That would be my guess. If that's not the case, probably want to talk to those DIB companies that change their
SSRMA for the DIB. We hope that's not the case.
Yeah. But that being said, it's obvious that there are certain nations that harbor the criminal element, maybe even offer or promote some of these activities. But I feel like that's starting to change already.
So coming back to a point that several of you have made about cyber norms, the lack of any clearly defined red lines at this point, but curious, when you think about China versus Russia versus Iran, are there beginnings, coming to your point, of rules or norms there? How do you see each of these nation states operating differently when it comes to these questions?
I would say that there is, in observation, I don't know that this is written down anywhere, but we have not seen a nation state sponsor a cyber attack that's the equivalent of an armed attack. And we've been very clear about that as a red line for the United States, that the equivalent of an armed attack is going to get you a response. But I think below that, I think it's very difficult to define norms. And, as someone, I recognize norms are often defined by state practice, and so I'm in the state practice business, and not necessarily in the norm writing business. But we think very carefully about that when we engage in activity. We think about, what is the reciprocal risk here? What is this? Do we stand behind this as a nation? Are we comfortable with the activity? Do we feel like we're doing the right thing here? And so I think over time you will see a body of behavior from responsible nation states, from democracies who are very capable in cyber, of the things that they do and don't do. But I think it's really hard to have a normative conversation with other countries because so much of this activity is clandestine. And so you can't really have sort of the open conversation that you do in the nuclear arena where it's like, let's verify each other's capability and let's talk about what targets we each have, because that kind of transparency just isn't available in the cyber domain. So I think we have to rethink how we establish that dialogue in the international space with allies and adversaries alike.
Can I ask you, Mika, can you define an armed attack for me? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think we have definitions, but the challenge of the armed attack is, of course, it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. There are, it's a significant consequence that we would assume. This is not the legal definition, so I apologize to my OGC colleagues. We're probably freaking out about this, but we're talking about destructive, loss of life, serious injury, those sorts of things. So we have not seen that. Now, it's obviously in the purview of a nation state to decide a particular attack is the equivalent of an armed attack and respond via force if they chose to, but we have not seen that happen yet in the international environment.
I think that'll make it interesting, like you even just look at colonial, I think that was a criminal element, doing a criminal attack in a nation that allows that sort of thing to happen, but I think there's a ton of unintended consequence there. So the hard part in cyber will be, holy crap, we did not want that to happen when we went on offense, and we blew it up by accident. So it'll be really hard to come up, in my opinion, with a red line in cyber. It's the infamous, you go back to Ronald Reagan's, you'll know it when you see it, comment on some other topic. It's a tough one. A lot of people have thought about it for a long time. And I just think on offense, you can't always predict the consequences of even encrypting a drive. You don't know if the server is going to crash in 5 minutes or 45 minutes. And then you heard about the DNS reliance. I mean, one domino falls, and next thing you know, people aren't getting water in Houston, and you're like, wow, didn't plan that one.
Yeah, it makes it hard to establish norms.
Yeah, this is actually a really important thing, I think, for the criminal element to be thinking about, though, when they're thinking like, oh, I want to stay off the radar of the most powerful nation on the world with like really large and impressive cyber capability, is that you, given what we were talking about with systemic risk, you may not know when that business system that you think you are compromising for fun and profit, from the criminal's perspective, is actually going to lead to physical consequences in the real world, because you may not know the dependencies. And so you may trip over something that is going to put you on the radar of people like me, and that's not going to be a fun day for you in the long run. But like that, I think that it's a very delicate thing, and we have to think a lot about sort of what are the interdependencies and what are the potential downstream effects of these things. And I think Kevin's right that like people could trip over something into a much bigger incident than they thought when they start in this activity.
Which again makes it really hard to enforce norms if you don't really know the intention.
Yeah. Let me challenge you on that one.
Sure.
All right. Do you agree that this country has lost billions of dollars in intellectual property?
Yes.
Okay, so my challenge to you then is, when you talk about norm setting and how difficult it is, do you think we should be doing it?
I think norm setting for espionage is going to be complicated. I really do, because the asymmetry is why North Korea is going to develop more of a cyber component. They're not going to beat us with tanks. I don't know if they know that, but they're probably not going to beat us with tanks. But cyber is just the asymmetry allows them to invest more. So I do believe criminal, we can define it. We can define as, and nations will sign it. We hate ransomware, let's do that, and impose economic risks to the nations that harbor those actors. Espionage, I don't think we're going to come up with a ton of agreement.
But I think, we get into definitional things about what espionage is, but the nation state responsible for stealing most of the intellectual property does that for economic advantage, right? The United States actually...
the infamous, like, where's the fine line between I'm securing my nation through economic advantage,
absolutely.
right? There's so somewhere it's going to blur, right?
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
But the United States does not define, right? The collection
Right.
of foreign intelligence
Yeah.
is about intent and capabilities.
Well, that's why I hesitate when you said billions of dollars in damage, because stealing the IP, then you got to go and do the work to replicate it. But I'd still say it's probably in the billions. I think we've lost a lot of competitive advantage.
I mean, we did try to define that as a norm in the Obama administration and address that directly. And for a while, we did see some limitation of activity.
I think you saw, what I think we saw anyways, we used to see over 80 attacks from one group in China to steal IP. And it went down to like 5 1 month before President Xi met with Obama. So clearly there's centralized control of this group anyway. And what was amazing is all the attacks against the hedge funds or the companies doing M&A in China did go down, at least from our observables. But I feel like the defense industrial base is still fair game.
I mean, I don't like hearing that.
Well, I mean, I'm just interpreting observations.
But yeah, I think, but this is an important conversation that I think nation states have to have with each other about what are the appropriate boundaries here. And that, a conversation with another national leader can sometimes yield a difference of activity. And so we should make sure that we're trying that option to try and reduce the risk to the United States.
One of the things that was interesting, Sean, you had said it, like a lot of people don't understand cyber. That goes the same for like all the groups that have command and control, where there's like a flag officer giving orders to a 24-year-old who's carrying them out. Because I'm still shocked that somebody called Hafnium said, hey, there's a patch coming out, so let's hack 100,000 servers. I mean, that's a little loud. And you could almost see the command and control break down a little bit, where somebody said, hey, we've got a great access. We have an exploit that works. It's a 0-day. Don't lose access. And the 23-year-old interpreted that with, okay, so let's just hack the world. I mean, we're going to have a lot of orders given by folks who don't understand the tech, and the folks on the front lines that implement it, you're going to see a disconnect there from time to time.
I would say, given the amount of time that I spend thinking about these things and working with these things inside the government and the amount of oversight that we have inside the Defense Department, I think mature nations need to have that. They need to have very clear understandings of what their forces are doing, that they're not doing things that they don't intend. And I'm not sure that all nations have that kind of insight into what's happening at other levels. And I think it's one of the basic principles of the United States military. And I think that we should be striving towards that in cyberspace as well.
And what do you think can be done to improve that? I think from your prior perch, the FBI, and from your current perch?
I think there's a bunch of things. Like I mentioned that multi-pronged approach, but I want to bring it back to the companies out there that are actually getting hit every day. And this is where I think you get into the JCDC that Director Easterly mentioned. Like, we have to make some type of hard wire where the private sector actually shares all of that information without repercussion. There has to be some type of standard hygiene that is out there. But if they're able to provide the government, and the government, it's a two-way street, right? That is a team sport there. It's a two-way street. But if they're able to get that picture of what that risk looks like, Jen's going to be able to do her job much better in that defend mission, right? We collectively, as in the private sector, are going to be able to understand the risk and defend it better. And it's also going to give, I think, the policymakers actually better information to have those discussions through the State Department, the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, to really, I think, combat the issue.
Yeah, I would say for the private sector, from a deterrence perspective, making sure that you are resilient to try and prevent some of those collateral impacts is really important, because there's a lot of deterrence that can happen against those criminal actors if people are in a position that it doesn't really provide an interruption. And it's the interruption that creates the motivation to pay. And so if people are resilient and it just sort of rolls off, then the criminal's not going to be able to cause that kind of incident. But that's not something that we in the government can, have a lot of control or insight into.
Kevin, anything you'd add here? Okay. So I wanted to come back to this question a moment ago that you had brought up about roles in the government, and just thinking about outside of law enforcement actions, how does the government demonstrate to the public that it's countering adversaries when cyber ops are often only working when they are done in secret? I don't know how you think about this, Miki. I think the
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really tough thing because in the department we don't discuss operational activity, but we are part of whole of government efforts to defend the nation, and that's been part of our mission since 2018, elections defense, and then you see us moving into that in the ransomware space. But those missions are not DoD alone. They are in support of our law enforcement partners. They are in support of DHS and how we work with them. And I think that we play an important role. You know, our capabilities are pointed outside the United States, but that's where often the adversaries are. And so we can help a lot identify tactics, techniques that the adversary is using, help locate, do all kinds of things like that to make law enforcement's job easier. But I think that it's really important for the American people to see, especially with the ransomware, that law enforcement is taking a public role in disrupting these kinds of activities. I mentioned a couple of instances of this before, but also with indictments, trying to arrest individuals when they travel to third countries, arrest them if they come to the United States, putting out indictments so that it's very clear what that we deem this activity as, you know, criminal and not legitimate. I think that those kinds of things are really important. The department's activities will necessarily not be something that we'll spend a lot of time talking about. Hopefully, for the reporters listening, please don't make me have to talk about them by writing really interesting articles. You know, I think it is something that there are ways that the American people can have confidence that their government is actually doing a lot more to defend against this particular threat. And we can talk about the mission that we've taken on.
So I would agree with you, and I think, right, everyone knows the FBI has a dual mission. It has an intelligence mission, and it has a law enforcement. I think we could do a better job with, like, the takedown as we did recently, you know, tracking the cryptocurrency and actually recovering that. And I think we can also accentuate the cooperation with the private sector. So I think that's important, and I think we can be more transparent doing that. Also, though, let's not forget, out in the private sector, there are a lot of cleared individuals, right? And we should be having that dialogue with them on the intelligence side to the extent that we can, right? And basically ensuring them that some of that is being met. I mean, that's very hard when you get into an intelligence operation, as far as it's just not going to go public. It's not sort of the nature of what they do in revealing techniques, tactics, and protocols, right? So I think it's a challenge. And Kevin, I'd be interested what you think on that. No, because you've done a lot of work, and when you did that first thing on the PLA, right, that foreshadowed, and you went to Congress.
Yeah. To me, you know, we can't just always play defense. I've said this for like 20 years. No matter what company you are with, no matter how many great people you have, great technology you have, you can have a bad day. On offense, even the crappiest hockey players, if they get 1,000 shots on goal, will put the puck in the net. And so I like what I'm seeing. I can sense there's going to be change, but nations do have to hold other nations accountable for harboring the criminal element, period. However, they got to do that. If you can't get to the person, and you may not be able to, you have to hold the nations accountable. So I think attribution matters, and that our government, to me, attribution, you know, the private sector can do the best they can there, but the reality is the sovereign nations are the ones that are going to have the bar for what's the line for attribution and confidence level, and then hold nations accountable to it. You know, the private sector will do its best. Like I can tell you the top board topic right now is resiliency. How do we make sure we can recover from backups, not pay a ransom, and have our core assets up and running in 6 hours? So the private sector, though, doesn't want to just play defense. They want to know that the people that are causing us harm, you know, I don't think Joe Blount should have had to go through what he went through. I don't think Frank Vacola at Casilla had to go through what he went through. These are good people. They were attacked. We need to impose risks and repercussions, and I think we have a government that's willing to do that. And I think we know, even internationally, I think you're going to see more effort to get attribution right. And we don't even need perfect. You just get to the right country, get to the right citizens behind it.
Yeah, you and Jen talked about the voluntary reporting, and I think this is actually really important. Even if companies get to the point where a ransomware attack is a resilient thing that's sort of a hassle and then they move on, it's really important for those of us who are on offense that people report those incidents, because then we can start understanding what kinds of victims attackers are going after. The government may be able to do something to help, but if people pay and don't say anything, then we don't necessarily know what the depth of capability is of the adversary and what kinds of targets they're going after. So it's really important that when people get hit, they are reporting to law enforcement, they're sharing that incident. I know it's really scary to sort of talk about it because, as Kevin's clients well know, that's a bad day for anybody. But we will be able to do something, or we hope that we will be able to do something if you tell us. We certainly won't be able to do anything if you don't tell us.
I appreciated your point, Sean, before, but if 80 to 90% of the risk is in the private sector, that 80 to 90% of the intel should be coming from there.
But to kind of add on to what they're saying, and Kevin was mentioning, like at the boardroom, this is the issue, right? And I would say it's the issue because regulators are actually stepping up. Right, so I'm working with boards where regulators are actually looking at them for their oversight of this risk. But I think we got to get, again, cyber risk, right? Well, what about those end-of-life systems, right? There's a lot of tech risk out there and tech debt that a lot of us call it, right? And they're not. It's hard to separate those. Right, and so I just think, these regulators, they need to get knowledgeable in this area. And it goes back to, what is the FTC doing? What is the CFPB doing? The OCC and Fed, I think most of us know in financial services, they're pretty active. The SEC is looking to do more in that area. I think, I would ask all our regulators need to step up, and the expectations from management and even boards.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing that. You're seeing that from Treasury now, right? Taking action against a crypto exchange. I think that and I would not expect that that'll be the last one, but to the extent that there are these exchanges that are facilitating criminal proceeds and are not able to show that their transactions are legitimate, I think that Treasury is looking very carefully at how to deal with that.
I want to come back to a point that you had started to make, Kevin, around sort of attribution and just how complicated it is here in this space between nation states and organized crime. And to this question of sort of cyber mercenaries, private actors that are operating at the behest of nation states, some of whom might actually be U.S. allies, and how you're thinking about distinguishing between these actors and criminal groups. I'm thinking like UAE and their operations against Iran, dark matter, where are we in terms of attribution?
I think the government has more tools to get it right. The private sector, we usually see it at victim networks. If an adversary is good, they can stay anonymous. As long as they're not lazy and they don't have an operational security blunder, it gets really hard. I'll just share it this way. In 2010, we've responded to about, 5,000, 6,000 breaches in the last 20 years. And we've always codified the trace evidence left behind in real nerdy ways with great rigor and discipline. We threw it in a database. In 2010, we only had 40 groups. Like everything we were responding to went nice and neatly into 40 different buckets. Oh, it's these guys from China. Oh, it's the Russian FSB again, or whatever it was. And now we're up to like 2,900 buckets. It may really only be 40, but everybody's changing so fast that the evidence we see today from the same hacker group is different than 3 months ago. So it's another number, and we're trying to join groups. Anonymity, the best hackers in the world are probably pretty darn anonymous. I think you get to the country, and then I think the government resources will get to the country. I do believe that. The challenge we have is this. If there ever is an attack that exploits the systemic risk we have, and we don't even know who did it, how do we proportionally respond? I think the whole game comes back to attribution. Because if something happens and we just don't like it as a nation, if we know who did it, let's go do something about it, whatever that may be, economic sanctions, diplomatic relations, whatever. But from my company's perspective, attribution is getting more complicated.
And why, Kevin, do you see the proliferation from the 40 to the hundreds
I think our defense is actually getting better so that the TTPs do have to change. I mean, you can't use IP address anymore for attribution. It just changes every single intrusion anyway. You know, for the SolarWinds intrusions, everybody had the attackers used a unique IP address set for every single victim. So, and then it never got used again. So the whole infrastructure was burned. Same thing I remember back in the Sony breach. The whole infrastructure used to do that breach was burned during that breach and never used again. So it's just, I think as our defense actually gets better, you force things like this year, we're having more 0 days than, I don't know, the last 5 years combined, it feels like, you know? And that means defense is getting better. The problem is we'll always have imperfect defense, so we got to think about imposing risk and consequence.
Okay, one last question. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left, but just wanted to quickly touch on cyber terrorism. There's been a lot of conversation about, you know, is this an unrealistic threat? Is it not? Is it possible that small groups or even individuals could cause a catastrophic incident? And if so, what does that really mean for the United States?
It's a great question. So I'll take the first.
How many ideas do we want to have go public on this one? Huh?
I would just say historically, terrorism was handled in a different way to neutralize the terrorists. And most terrorist groups thought it was to their disadvantage to use or have a digital footprint. So I don't think we saw a lot of activity in that space. I think more concerning is what we saw with the Israeli water supply system and what was done there. And when you're looking at more nation-state, bioterrorism type activities that are more concerning, but I'm not, I mean, I'll defer to my DOD colleague if she wants to comment more on that.
Sharika's really glad you deferred to her.
I know. I don't know that there's a whole lot I can say about this. I think, you know, certainly it's on our list of threats that we're tracking, and I think that beyond that, I'm gonna not say anything.
You know, bottom line, as the impact grows to cyber breaches, it'll be a tool used by more and more entities. Anytime there's geopolitical difference or ideological difference, you got to perceive a threat to the nation.
Well, on that sobering point, thank you all so much for your time here. It's been a really great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
Kelly.
you.
Kelly, thanks for moderating that panel. Sean, Mika, Kevin, thanks for a great conversation. So let me introduce our last panel of the morning or afternoon, depending on where you are watching this. We have a really great conversation coming up here, moderated by Chris Krebs, who is the Senior Newmark Fellow for Cyber Policy here at the Aspen Institute, as well as Maureen Allison, the CISO for Johnson & Johnson, which has had a interesting last year in terms of its threat profile and issues on Maureen's desk. Newport Davis, the CISO for Comcast, and Ron Green, the Chief Security Officer for MasterCard. So Chris, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Garrett. It's been a great session so far. We've heard a lot about systemic cyber risk, and I want to unpack that a little bit more, maybe put a little bit of context around it. But before I go there, Jen Easterly's comments, CISA Director comments were fantastic this morning. I did take one straight in the heart with the retirement of the pineapple on pizza. So I look forward to what the next disinformation, spirit, animal, fruit, whatever it may be, and I look forward to the kind of who's that Pokemon game that they'll play. But just know that pineapples will forever live on. There are socks. So, all right, let's get into it. So what we've heard a lot about today is systemic cyber risk, which effectively amounts to a horizontal. So it cross-cuts a number of different vertical sectors that make up the economy. What I'd like to start with, though, is that vertical piece and talk about vertical systemic risk. Jay Healy this morning talked about the cyberspace solarium and the systemically important critical infrastructure. And that is about the vertical risk posed to the economy, essentially. There are horizontal aspects, but ultimately it's about those national critical functions that if they fail, we have a big problem on our hands. What I think is so fascinating about the makeup of this panel is these are really the three of the most critical sectors in the American experience over the last 18 months. So Johnson & Johnson, we have a vaccine, Newport with Comcast and Xfinity, we have this remote workforce, we have digital learning, the shift in the dynamics, and then Ron with MasterCard and the payments and how everything went touchless and contactless and all our online purchases. So let's start there and tell us a little bit about the last 18 months and how did your thinking about risk management change, and how are you adapting and agile in the environment? So, Maureen, start with you because you and I were kind of in the trenches there initially last March.
My very first call was to Chris. Hey, Chris, guess what? So, in healthcare, we've always been like the criminal elements coming at us. We do know that there's a nation state that's out there looking for intellectual property. We did see some destruction with NotPetya and some of our peer companies, but we've always been what I call in the middle of the pack. We've never been the target, the true target, and we were never at the back and nobody ever cared about us. The creation of vaccines, and it wasn't just because my company did it, changed the threat profile of healthcare in a second. Overnight, we went from kind of in the back, just in the middle of the pack, to leading threat, or leading attack surface. And that was huge. I look at some of my government service, why I immediately knew that it was very, Chris, how am I going to talk to a government overseas or in Europe about classified information or something that happens? How are we going to do that? And so it was really expanding us into the government is now part of my incident response, where before it was, I tell you about the indicators of compromise. Now it was, the government was part of my
and the government has something to bring to the table from an Overwatch perspective, because collection very likely shifted in that time period. Like, okay, we understand that R&D around a vaccine is one of those crown jewels of the United States, and how do we bring the powers of national defense to bear in support? And in part, that's what was behind Operation Warp Speed, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so shifting gears here, internet infrastructure. So it's not just about the digital workforce and that moment, that snap of March 13th. And I remember we had a number of phone calls across the sectors where we had a bunch of public health officials on, and CEOs and CISOs were asking about remote work and what that shift is, and when do we make that shift? What should we be looking for? And what was the answer? The answer was always, oh, it's not a trigger, it's a dial. You'll have to adjust. Oh no, it was a trigger. It was schools going home. It was remote distance learning. Immediately workforces didn't have childcare. And so we all sent them. So what was the experience like, not just in Comcast Xfinity, but across the industry?
Oh, yes. And March 13th was the date. I mean, I will always remember.
Friday the 13th.
It's Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th.
Absolutely. So, we responded, and just in an amazing way. I think the teams that came together to respond to that situation. People literally slept in the office. There were people working, around the clock, moving gear from one location to another. There was no way to do that in our traditional ways, right? So people literally getting in cars and vans, and so it was a tremendous amount of work. But what we saw happen is, we constantly invest in the network, and that investment, thank goodness, gave us a really good baseline. But my goodness, how quickly we had to respond to that. And the first response was just the symmetry changed, right? Because the upload and download combination changed, because now you're doing everything from, doctor conferences to Zoom calls to
streaming, gaming,
work,
everything.
Gaming,
yeah.
and people had more time on their hands, so they're like wanting to watch more movies, and so all of that happened, and we had to literally reconfigure the network on the fly, and add capacity on the fly. One thing that really became important for us, and it's always been important, people forget that cybersecurity actually has 3 pillars, right? Because there's so much attention paid to like data breaches and regulations around privacy and sensitive data, we forget that there are 2 other pillars, right? Confidentiality is one, and then integrity and availability are the other 2. And for us, that availability bit at that moment in those first 4 weeks was so critical across our company, from a cyber point of view, from a network engineering point of view, from our people in the field who never actually went home because they were critical workers. So they worked throughout the worst parts of the pandemic. So it was tremendous response, and I'm really proud to say that we and our other partners all came together, and we absorbed that shock and were able to keep moving forward.
I think there's going to be a really interesting case study about that investment in the network that you talked about, and how that is an example of building resilience into your risk management strategy.
Totally.
Because there were other geographies, including Europe, that were still running on copper to underpin their internet infrastructure that did not, that were not able to absorb that punch. And fiber here, and so do you want to talk about that?
Not just fiber, but virtualization of the network, right? So we had been working on that, and those 6 to 8 weeks, it's kind of really interesting to go back and reflect on those. But I think our entire virtualization strategy leapt forward by 2 years. So, our roadmaps were showing us, okay, we'll have this many VCMTSs and this many, and it just got compressed. It's like, what we were going to do in 18 months, we're now going to do in 8 weeks. And that is when, the good fundamentals really help, because those teams were kind of already working in how do we develop things securely. And so now it was just more things they were developing securely in a faster way. So really amazing resilience of our people, more than anything else, that we were able to pull that off.
So Ron, I want to pick up on a thread that Newfound talked about with that 2 years of really rapid advancement taking place in several weeks. And talk a little bit about your industry, particularly payments and contactless, and what did you see in that crazy spring of 2020?
It's 2 things, right? So it's on the contactless payments, we saw like a massive rise in the desire and our deployments of contactless. Within that second quarter itself, we delivered more contactless solution to customers than we did the previous year, 5 times more.
Wow.
And so massive advancements on that front, but then just a caution and do no harm. So every quarter we work together with our customers to enable new services and solutions and upgrading of our network. It's a coordinated effort, requires impact, interaction with all of our customers just to support it, just to make sure it comes off flawlessly, because when people are out there and they're buying things, they want that nanosecond response time to come back so they can, buy the medication that they need, buy the food that they need, whatever it is, they don't want to hear that our network's down. So in that second quarter where it was now everybody's reverting back to home, and our customers were impacted by, not knowing if their employees were going to be able to come in and support the whole change. So the first time in like 20 years, we held off a change on that quarter because we wanted to make sure that do no harm, We want to make sure that people can get access to whatever it is that they're trying to get to as we sort all of this out in the coming year.
It's funny because I've been back on the road traveling a little bit lately, and I think there's still some communities that are perhaps a little bit left behind in tangent here, but the hospitality industry, I think particularly when you're talking about a hotel room service or the custodial crews, we still need maybe some touchless options for leaving tips behind in the rooms.
And so just tipping people is still the thing for us to solve.
Yeah, I mean, cash, I can't tell you the last time I had cash in my wallet. It's just one of those things.
Yeah, we were just talking about that this morning.
So let's shift gears here a little bit and make that pivot over to the horizontal systemic risk that we've talked about a little bit here today. And thinking about how within your organization you manage your enterprise and how you think about it, whether it's the systemic piece, which we talked about, which I tend to think is really about third-party aggregated risk, where you have a finite number of solutions, just like, again, like Jay Healy was talking about, from a set number of providers that you are dependent upon, just like everyone else. And then you have to go back to the edge, and it's really the things that are the basics within your networks, your vulnerability management, multi-factor authentication. So can you talk about, Maureen, we'll start with you, of how you think of your risk registry? What are those things that are internal, external, and how you balance and develop a good holistic risk strategy?
Yeah, you know, I've looked over the years and how we as security professionals, we will protect everything equally. And I've now had to change to business resiliency. And what is the risk, business risk? And then looking at that. Over the last 18 months, obviously, we pivoted to what we were doing with the vaccine. And so it gives a different view of things. And what I noticed was there will be some things that I will not patch. I can't patch. It's not worth the effort or the dollar. And I think sometimes as security professionals, we really like the idea of perfect security. And I think we heard a lot of the just patch everything, know everything that's everywhere all the time, and it'll be good. But the reality is, will you ever? And especially as we move into the digital world and code is going out all the time, are there some places that it really isn't that important? And that my big pivot was into cyber resiliency and business risk.
Okay. Jennifer, how are you thinking about this? With just a massive
it's massive.
Infrastructure.
It is just massive. And Maureen and I were actually talking about this over lunch yesterday, that I think there's probably more in common with us, who are running these massive systems than even in our verticals. Because the kind of problems that we face at scale are very different than somebody who might be in the same vertical but not facing that same scale. I totally agree with Maureen that if you've got 10,000 endpoints, you look at them about, okay, I can patch them. If you've got 500,000 or more, then it's always a risk discussion. So, but to go back to systemic risk, so we worry about probably 4 categories, wide categories. One is devices. We have devices through supply chains, all the way from the chips that go into those devices to the software that goes into devices, and the devices are in our customers' homes, and we take that very seriously. So that ecosystem that comes from that chip level to device level to the software that runs on it, and then how it interconnects into the wider ecosystem. So we pay a lot of attention to that. The second is the components in our systems. We are more and more DevOps, DevSecOps, so we have software being built and delivered multiple times a day. And even something like a bill of material is an ephemeral point in time thing, right? And so how do we kind of build software composition analysis, for example, into those, so that we see that systemic risk and see where we may be impacted and where we may be impacting the next part down the chain. The third is third parties. The risk from working with third parties who are our partners, we can't do our work without them, but they connect to our network, store data. How do we manage that risk? And then finally, the one that I've been really thinking about a lot is the concentration of components that we use among very few entities. And I'll give a perfect example. Director Esterly this morning talked about multi-factor. And I would guess, this is just like, I don't know the actual metric, but I would guess that half of the planet uses one single supplier of multi-factor authentication systems, right? So think about that risk, that systemic risk, that if something happens to that system and it's compromised, we are trusting so much in our zero trust environments to that. So I do worry a lot about that. And then just one final thing, I also worry about the increasing gap between our hyperscale platform providers and the people who are using those platforms. And that's a very long conversation, so I won't double click on it right now. But I see systemic risk in that gap.
Okay.
And as that gap gets bigger, I see that risk getting bigger. So deeper conversation someday.
Got it. And I do have it for the record that it was 17 minutes before our first reference to zero trust. And I do want to come back to that though, because the question I always have is, what does zero trust mean to you?
Totally.
And what did it evolve from? Assume breach, layer defense, but let's not go there yet, because I also want to touch on your CIA triangle that you mentioned before, because there's a really important piece to unpack there on the availability side.
Yes.
Okay.
Totally.
Ron, where are you?
Me, on risks that I think about for our organization, first I'll start with, it's three things. First, it's internal risks. It's the things that, like Maureen said, you can't do everything. There's no such thing as zero risk in the security environment. So sometimes you make decisions and now you have to track the mitigation to make sure that those are completed, or you have to enhance or mature a particular security program that you have. So what you're doing on the inside, that's the first thing I think about. It's near and dear to me. It's a primary mission. Second is, and it's still supportive of the first, which is our third parties. We've been, I think we got to a place where doing the annual reviews and the annual on-sites, those are how we judge our third parties. But if you look at incidents that have taken place over time here, that just isn't enough. And we're moving, or we already have implemented some continual monitoring requirements around our third parties to always have a finger on the pulse of how they're doing and what they're doing. In addition to when things come up, like we talked about, new vulnerabilities being released and them being a critical thing for us to resolve, having the processes and communication paths to reach out to those suppliers and getting an understanding of whether or not they know the suppliers that supply them are well protected against that. And it's something that we work with them and we chase that down. That's second, third party risk. And the third thing for us is the ecosystem. If we're secure, but left and right merchants are being compromised and consumers lose faith or trust in the ability for their transaction to be secured, that's still a threat to us. Right. So, we've done a lot of things and we do a lot of things to provide security solutions to others in the ecosystem. We engage in things like the Cyber Readiness Institute or the Global Cyber Alliance in order to help even the small mom and pop shops raise their security game by not just telling them what the good thing is, but to actually give them things that they can implement in their environment today for free, just to raise the level of security. If not all the way up, just a little bit. Every little bit helps.
This is jumping ahead a little bit here, but what this dynamic you're talking about where the products and services are pushing solutions out further to the edge to protect the user, because the user is effectively in a position where they're not in a position to help themselves. And so what can you do to make them more secure, to maintain that trust and confidence in the overall product, the service, and the ecosystem? I think that's the future. whether you're in the software products and services space or in the internet infrastructure space, seeing more solutions being pushed down to the consumer.
Totally.
That's the only answer.
No, totally. I'll just give you an example. So we, and I'm forgetting, recently, 2 or 3 years ago, started to just, anybody who buys a gateway from us, has anything that they connect through that gateway, through a wired or wireless connection, is protected. We look for malware, we look for network traffic, we look for bad sites, we look for, and it's all AI ML driven. It's just embedded and it's there by default. And you just have to do that. And by the way, it's mutually beneficial, right? Because you don't want rampant malware on your network. And of course, you're protecting your customer, which is your number one goal. But I totally agree with you that it's got to move closer and closer to the edge to where these systems are being used in their day-to-day way.
And I'm seeing it a little bit as we see the ESG movement at the board level emerge with environmental sustainability and governance. I'm seeing a similar shift towards stakeholder responsibility, away, not away from shareholder responsibility, but inclusive of stakeholders, the users in the bigger ecosystem, because there's such a brand and reputational hit that can happen if you don't invest and think 3 to 4 steps out.
Well, I think the ESG topic is very interesting because we're now starting to see that data protection as part of the brand. And we saw, 7 or so years ago when multiple companies were hit, not that there was terrible impact on their brand, but you just saw the news on it, and does anyone on their stock even. And so that as a sustainability, data protection is a driving. And as we move into the digital world, I think we're going to just see more of that.
And I think it's all wrapped up in this bigger awareness at the corporate, at the C-suite level and the board level that really my hope is that Colonial was a great leap forward in awareness, particularly across consumer brands, and that cyber is no longer, like the last panel talking about PII and intellectual property theft, that you may not see a manifestation or realization for 10 plus years. Now you're like, oh, this is a business disruption risk.
Yes, availability.
So I'm not shipping to the availability
Absolutely.
point.
Right.
And which is then I'll tie back to the CISA, the Cyber Essentials, where the number one point is it starts at the top. And if the leader is not on board, your jobs as CISOs are incredibly difficult.
Almost, yes.
It makes it almost impossible. But leaning into that, it's almost like what we did, those Y2K days, right? We've been around for the Y2K days, and how important the business continuity planning. Now, cyber has a new role as cyber resilience, and those are scenarios that most of us are working out with our BCP planning, because that's a more likely, because of all the things that were put in place, generators and dual redundancy for networks and dual redundancy for power are all things that have been previously done. Now in cyber, we're starting to see that type of resiliency be built in.
I'd say it's part of what we're seeing more with the engagement of our executives, our CEOs, and CFOs, and even our board in wanting to actually review how we respond to a cyber incident and participating in our cyber exercises, where in the past it might have been something that's done by the teams deep within the organization. Now they all want to understand, well, what is the playbook for how we respond to ransomware? How do we respond to these things? They want to know it in case it happens, because they see it happen every day.
And that's that shift that we've been, just praying for over the last couple of years, was that shift from technical risk to business risk.
Correct.
And there was the RSA conference a couple of years ago. I think the theme was hope, and there's a little bit of hope here. That at the executive level, we get it, and the investments are happening. Now the job's on us at the defender level of demonstrating return on investment to the bigger enterprise.
But I also think we're starting to see in one of the other panels, there was a discussion on regulation, and I always kind of cringe at the word regulation, But I do see where will it be the SEC? Because from the large companies, the Fortune 100, is it really SEC would have that visibility, and then to use a framework, not always their IT controls, because SOX is somewhat not what we would want, but could we use the governance framework of the SEC and audit committees to report in a manner that really takes your CISO out of the picture of what is being reported?
So that, I really want to build on that, because I think it's super important. And we've been on this journey where we want, for our first, second, and third line of defense, we really want the same systems of record, the same sources of truth, the same. So we've invested a lot in automating that. So we just connect, our controls just connect to the systems of record and sources of truth. At any given time, you can go and any level of that 3 level of defense can go and say, these controls are now maybe starting to deviate, and I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. And that constant visibility at that control level is, and we're just starting, right? So but we have a journey ahead of us. But I'm already seeing so much positive response from that one thing that and now along with that is that part of, how do we get people to take ownership across the company? So it's not just the CISO, it's not just building some kind of an attestation model, right? That goes, hey, a business leader, these are your controls, right? Not just ours. And the great response has been how everybody's just leaned into that. But I'm really excited about what I see like 2 years from now, when we build that whole infrastructure out.
So we were talking about regulatory requirements, and I'm all for having the right level of regulatory requirements, but for the love of all that's good. The problem I see is, we're a global company, and we have regulatory requirements coming at us from all directions, and they're all like a permutation of the other requirements. And it's like one group learns from another and says, oh, I want to add this couple extra stuff here. And they will all tell you it's all 80% of the same thing. It's just 20% different. But 20% different over 100 times is still a mess. So I've even talked about this to the G7 cyber experts group, that if we could get some regulatory convergence, if there is a set of requirements that everyone could agree to, that we could prove out ourselves against, and that we could leverage it in other places, it would actually allow us to demonstrate that we're secure or not. And instead of investing in teams, like people upon people, checking the boxes differently than just hiring staff to handle all of those requirements, we could take that and actually invest that into further maturing security.
Yeah,
totally.
I think it's worth acknowledging, though, that across the companies represented here on the panel, that you're in the haves space, right? And there's a significant have-nots community. And I think the thing that we really have to focus on solving for is that knowledge and capability transfer from the haves and the have-nots. I think that's where we have struggled as a community, particularly from some of the larger events of the last few years, is really distilling down what was the systemic failure in the SVR Nobelium SolarWinds event that we need to learn from and bake into our architectures and operating mechanisms. So again, with the recent executive order and the Cyber Incident Review Board that someone is standing up in the federal government that will look at those issues, and just like after any other major event, you do lessons learned and you have an improvement plan and you stick to it and you roll it out. But we've got to continue, I think, pushing those best practices down.
Well, and it's really for those smaller companies. Are they even regulated? I mean, in banking or finance, they might be. But in healthcare, I know we've talked before, do they, even if you give them an indicator of compromise, will they know, do they have the machines to look at it?
And this is, I think, we're getting we're rabbit holing a little bit here, but it's a good one because if you think back to NotPetya,
Right.
supply chain, if you think about the Chinese cloud hopper activity from 2018-19, targeting MSPs, the horrible joke I've used in the past is it's like when they ask Willie Sutton why he robs banks, because that's where the money is, why the Chinese go after the MSPs, that's where the data and the access is. So how do we think about MSPs, and I'm not talking hyperscale clouds, I'm talking the dozen plus all the way out to hundreds that feed the small and medium enterprises. How do we ensure that they're implementing the right practices on their own that then get pushed down? Because to the third party risk, when you're letting somebody in to the environment, what are the questions you should be asking? And again, to Jay Healy's point, do you even have leverage on the MSP to ensure that they're doing the right things from a security perspective?
And do you do it in a way that you don't suffocate them?
Yeah.
Because, I worry about that. Like, if I see our new, information security requirements that, anybody who does business with us has to sign, I worry about what innovation am I stifling because a small company can't even deal with those, right? So it's both sides of that you have to worry about.
And again, I think that goes to the pushing it out further to the edge where you make it easier for them, where it's turnkey solution, security, MFA by default.
Totally.
No more SFA and password dependent environments. All right, let's do a quick lightning round here. Let's go back to COVID.
Okay.
From just an overall perspective, what was the thing that you learned that you will be implementing and adjusting your security approach going forward? Because yes, there will be more pandemics, and we're not out of this one yet anyway. So, what was your key takeaway from a security risk management perspective from COVID? Maureen, I'll start with you.
I've got a million, but
Okay.
I think the thing is to look at the security events holistically, because when we started to and I'm not sure you can do it almost real time, but when we started to look at ransomware that was in the environment, and I'm talking very low level at a PC level, not major database, when we looked from 2018 to August of 20, we had 20 a month. And then we went up to 65 a month. From September, October, November, December. And then in January, a DDoS attack tried to get to us. And then we fell off to 10. Now, because I said that, I'll probably get 40 this month. But I would tell you that looking at those things holistically is intel. Yep. And that's where I go to the incidents, is how do I make intelligence out of my incident? I have, a large amount of events that occur. It's noise till we can make it something that's real. And so we have to, as organizations, working with the government, be able to make intel out of our noise.
And there's we're all in this together, so how do you operationalize that from an information sharing? All right, Nupur, what's the one key thing?
I think the biggest key for us was, that the perimeter is just disappeared. It was disappearing, but there is no perimeter anymore. And that really, again, accelerated things that were on our roadmap. Yep. So it didn't make us kind of go, oh my gosh, I have to do everything differently. It was just, how do I now implement in, months what were on my 5-year roadmap, right? So that was the biggest, I think, aha, is like, just forget all the perimeter stuff that we've been working on for years.
All right, so we're going to come right back to that. But
sure.
Ron.
I actually think the biggest thing I learned, kind of what Nupur has, and that is, like we had identified a lot of initiative that would help to take our organization into the next phase of where it needs to be security-wise, and these were the right things to do. It just we had a methodical plan of executing it out, and then when COVID happened, that plan that we were working on became this. You can't do it in 2 years. You got to do it in 6. You got to do it now, and it harkens me back to my time in the government where, like, we would put initiatives together and we would have them ready, waiting for other people not to have any money, so then bang, we could just roll with it. So when we have our initiatives, we just need an ability to know if someone said, screw it, no, you need to do it now.
Yeah.
Having an ability to execute it and know that you're going to get it across the line when the whole company is now turned and pivoted and waiting for you to get this thing that you thought would take 2 years that you now have to get done in 6 weeks?
So I get two primary questions these days. The first one is, why is it so bad, and is it ever going to get better? And the answer is no, it's not. There will only be more threat actors, and for the rest of humanity. I'll just put that stake out there. And we will only become more digitized. We will only plug more things in. So the landscape is incredibly complex, and so we're now in that space where, all right, we accept our mortality, and we're going to have to do more risk management. So what does that look like? And the second question, relatedly, is zero trust. Right? So to you, rapid fire question, what is zero trust to you, and what's the hardest part about it? Maureen, we'll start with you again.
Zero trust, if you're a network vendor, you're going to say SASE and CASB are the answers, and you should start there. But I would really say it's understanding your crown jewels, understanding what they really are, and then segmenting them out, which will get you into software-defined networking and CASBs and the like, especially as you go to the cloud. Because where are your crown jewels? But really the primary thing is the thing that we all have loved dearly for the last 20 years or so. It's identity and access management. Who has access to what data, with what permissions, from where? And in today's digital environment, it just adds that contextual approach, and especially where your data, some people may not even almost never have to come through your network. They are always on the outside. But how do you know who they are? And it gets down again, identity and access management.
All right. Next.
So to us, we have two principles around zero trust. One is that we don't trust anything, any person, device, or application. We have to do just-in-time contextual authentication and authorization. So that's one. And the second is that despite all of your precautions, assume you'll be breached. And so the question is the blast radius. How do you contain the blast radius? So that leads to microsegmentation. So those are our two principles: microsegmentation for the network, and then do not trust any person, device, or application that tries to access an asset.
Which that blast radius piece, Maureen, is key context around your ransomware events, the 28 to 60.
Totally. Right.
That you can have a ransomware event on a single machine.
Right. It doesn't affect
You isolate
anything.
it, you knock it down, you bring it back up, but you learn from it.
Yes.
Correct. As soon as you see it happen, it's isolated, it's off the network.
Right.
So again, it's microsegmentation, but we look at it as response to ransomware today.
Yeah, so zero trust for me is, so we'll have all of the classic security controls, but it really is greater identity and access control. And it is, getting just in time. So when you need it, just enough, only what you need, and then just for now, just for the period of time that you need to execute that thing, and all of the requirements, and not just a human, but for a device as well. Exactly. Having all of the right criteria and understanding about that identity making that transaction. I think identity is also, this is something that we can take on as like a national initiative. When I think about payments, so a lot of people think about the PAN, which is the 16-digit number, but really it's about the identity. And if we can enable a digital identity in a way that we can leverage it for payments, but we can leverage it for healthcare. We can leverage it for providing access in our environment. We can leverage it to let the refrigerator buy some milk rather than buying diamonds and stuff like that. If we had a way of doing that, or if we had an opportunity to focus on that, we should really do that.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to wrap this up with a question that it's multiple choice in the sense that you get to pick your choose your own adventure here. Okay, so when I think about the role of government in cybersecurity and in information technology in general, they have four roles: consumer, enforcer, law enforcement, defender. You think about cybercom and NSA from an operations perspective, and then advisor/helper. So pick one and tell me what more you want to see the government do in one of those roles. I'll start. So, moderator's prerogative. Consumer, I thought what the executive order did by upping the level of requirements for governments or for IT providers selling into the government, whether it's the SDLC and build environment, and we talked about SBOM. I think that was the government finally really harnessing its power of the purse to achieve better, and there'll be cascading benefits because the same SKU, effectively, the government buys that industry buys. So.
Yeah. Actually, I'll start on that, and I agree because when I read the EO, that was my first response. Is that because you can go and look in the past how this has happened, right? So it's history will repeat itself, and I hope it does. I think as those items are implemented, and then those become requirements for people who are doing business with the government, then they become requirements with the next line and soon, the entire ecosystem is uplifted. And in fact, we're starting to see, because all of us are not just consumers, we're also suppliers, right? So we're starting to see some of those requirements starting to show up already in our RFPs, right, that we have to respond to. So totally agree that I think that's a great area. The other area that I would love more is in that advisory. And I know that for that, you need a closed loop system, right? Because to advise, you also need information.
Right.
And so, how do we get to, in a non-burdensome way? And that's the key, is, how do we get to that? So where, we have the government agencies collecting and in a non-burdensome way, and then disseminating that back in an advisory fashion would be amazingly helpful. Not just for us, but I think especially for that, that entire, the smaller businesses that don't have as much to invest.
All right, Ron, real quick, and then we'll close it out with Maria.
Yeah, there's so many things I could ask them to work on. Let me pick on one that I haven't talked about, but it is, I think the government is in a unique place where they can help us across sector and across industry groups respond collectively to an advanced attack. So we know who we think we should engage in case a bad thing should happen, but can we exercise more? Can we actually have where my team members will participate in an exercise, even at a technology level, in a fight where they're working with our government partners, they're working with our communication partners, they're working with our energy partners, just working across the board, the merchants. I think there's an opportunity for the government to really help us get a better understanding of how we can respond as a country so we don't have to find it out for the first time in a real lab.
All right, Maureen, bring us home.
I think one of the areas, and we talk about SolarWinds as a supply chain attack. We've been seeing them for decades. But they haven't been on the front page of any paper, so everyone ignored them. But if the government, in looking at these IT systems, and it falls back into SBOM and bill of materials, but today, almost every technology can be impact in the critical infrastructure and the whole ecosystem. So if there was a mechanism, if somebody has a vulnerability, and in our medical device business at J&J, if one of these vulnerabilities come out and I have a vulnerability out of it, I have to report to CERT, and it comes out, hey, there's this vulnerability. I believe that helping in the guidance of what is the next vulnerability, and it's not getting it on Patch Tuesday. We were talking last night about, we love Patch Tuesday. It's really good because you get to go through all parts of your organization looking for what piece of that is somewhere else. And that would be very helpful if we could get this up front and know that these vulnerabilities were there.
Got it. Well, hey, I want to thank y'all for two things real quick. First, thank you for the panel today and your insights. It's been absolutely critical. But I also want to thank you individually and your organizations for what you've done over the last year and a half to get this country through the pandemic, from getting us a vaccine to keeping us online and educated and being able to work, and then keeping commerce up and running. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Just to echo what Chris said, it's just great to see such strong cybersecurity leadership across pharma, telecommunications, financial services. we're in good hands. For our final session, we're coming to our final session now. I'm glad to bring to the stage my friend and colleague, Garrett Graff, our own Director of Cyber Initiatives at the Aspen Institute, part of Aspen Digital, and Rob Joyce, who most of you already know, is the current Director of the Cybersecurity Directorate at the National Security Agency. And over to you. Thank you.
So, thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Rob, for joining us. You have been a friend of the Aspen Cyber Summit for many years now, and it's great to have you back on the stage in yet another new role.
It's awesome to be here.
So let me start by actually asking you about something that we saw from the NSA in the last 24 hours here, where we saw you and other government partners put out a warning about VPN vulnerabilities. And I wonder if you could talk both a little bit about the purpose of that as a warning, and what, if anything, you can say that prompted it at this moment, but then also talk a little bit more about what seems to be a growing strategy of these joint warnings from government to consumers and companies about the types of things that government wishes people were paying more attention to.
Sure, Garrett. So this was a document that talked about what you should have in consideration for securing your VPNs. And it was done jointly with CISA. They're our deep partner these days, right? There's almost nothing we put out that we don't do jointly with CISA, often CISA, NSA, and FBI together. And we looked at it and said, there's so much online, right? There is so much effort to be safe online, and what we wanted were the criteria for how you do that. And it really came down to two things. One, the selection, making sure you had a reputable product, and two, how you locked it down and removed some of the vulnerabilities from that space. And we thought between the deep technical expertise and what we saw in foreign space from folks exploiting those, it was good advice the government could give out there, and last 24 hours, a lot of really great response to that kind of information and sharing.
And was there any specific incident that triggered this, or specific threat that you were seeing behind the scenes that sort of led you to do this in September rather than a couple of months ago or a couple of months from now?
Yeah, no specific warning. It really is the culmination of watching the ecosystem working together to coordinate really good, positive advice, distill it down. That's the other thing. We can write 50 pages easily. It's when you try to get things down to a consumable, action-oriented outcome that it's much harder. So it just took some time.
Yeah. So 4 years ago, you were at the White House as the cyber coordinator with the National Security Council in the first year of the Trump administration. Talk to us a little bit about how now in the first year of the Biden administration, the threat landscape looks different to you, and what's changed and sort of what's at the top of your radar right now.
Yep. So you've heard it woven throughout today, right? The idea that cyber crime has become a national security issue. That to me is a dramatic change, and you see the government utilizing all elements of our power to include the foreign intelligence team and the offensive cyber team out there in the efforts to work against ransomware. So, we work very closely with the FBI, CISA, and others, to include Treasury. And in that space, it's very clear that even though it's a criminal issue, indictments and arrests aren't going to push us out the other end of that tunnel. So we've got to get a more complex playbook. And so it's got all of us talking about the tools and infrastructure, the ecosystem, because if you can't make profit from it, you're disincentivized. The people, because as we identify them, there's all sorts of action that can happen. And then finally, that safe haven. And it's really clear, as long as there's safe havens like Russia, there's going to be this problem. So intel-driven diplomacy and figuring out how we're going to work with allies to move Russia off the point where these criminals feel that they're untouchable in that space. So that's certainly the number one, is the ransomware activity. Number two is the topic that Chris Krebs and the Aspen Foundation are so invested in. That's the disinformation space. we've watched people use the cyber environment both as a cybersecurity problem, but also just as a malign influence problem. That's big change too. Third is we still have the nation state threats, right? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they roll off so easy because those are the big ones we always see doing very, just obnoxious things in cyberspace. And they haven't dialed back. They're still continuing. It's a testament that the cyber crimes rising above that noise floor, but they're still there. And things like the Microsoft Exchange server hacks that hit just massive amounts of entities across the globe. The SolarWinds supply chain attack show that they are looking to, at scale, achieve and maintain presence. Both for intel, but also for operational activity, and also staying in that space so that they have the agility to move to places they can't predict today that they might want to go to tomorrow. And then finally, I'd say it's the critical infrastructure. We've always known and worried about the presence in the critical infrastructure, but the last 5 years, it's just, it's the case where we're seeing and aware of much more intent and capability against that, and it's a world that's got to be locked down for our national security.
Let me take you through those sort of 4 nation-state threats, because we actually, one of the things that's unique about the Cyber Summit this year is in past years, that is normally what we spend much of the day talking about, or those sort of big 4, and today it has been a ransomware conversation sort of threaded through instead many of our topics. What does Russia look like to you online today? And leaving aside the question of the ransomware and cybercrime aspect of it, where do you see its nation-state level activity focused?
Yeah. They are the disruptive force. They're often trying to not increase their activity, but tear down others. So you see the misinformation, malign information. They are very active in the intelligence gathering activities still, both against governments, critical infrastructure. And then the concern is that effort that we've seen them actively use disruptive effects around the globe. And we've seen evidence of pre-positioning against U.S. critical infrastructure. So all things that can't be tolerated and we need to work against.
And you are the author of what is probably the most famous line about nation-state cyber threats. Russia is a hurricane, China is climate change.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to claim ownership of that, but it certainly got picked up as a quote when Krebs and I were doing a discussion.
Well, he had a much less memorable version of it. And I wonder if you could sort of talk then about China, and does China sort of still look like climate change to you?
They do. Scope and scale, China's off the charts, right? The amount of Chinese cyber actors dwarfs the rest of the globe combined. So they have scale. You talked about the difference 4 or 5 years ago to today. The difference I see is we respected them less. It was always broad, loud, and noisy. And what we're finding, when you have a resource base that large, that the elite in that group really are elite, right? It's a law of large numbers. And so the high end of the Chinese sophistication is really good. So we've got to continue to understand, disrupt, and then find ways across the whole of that technology to kind of push back. I like I think it was Kevin Mandian earlier today talked about the hockey analogy, where if you just keep shooting at goal and it's undefended, eventually you're going to score. That's how we feel across a number of these nation-state activities is, yes, defense is really important, but you also have to work to disrupt. So that's the continuous engagement strategy out of the department. And the idea that we've got to put sand and friction in their operations so they don't get just free goal, shots on goal to keep trying and trying and trying. And folks think about that when they hear persistent engagement, continuous engagement kind of terms. They think offensive cyber. it is, but I would say that the releases we've done jointly with CISA and FBI about the end day vulnerabilities that those teams like to use, that knocks them back just as much and is just as important. So finding those ways that we expose tools and infrastructure, that we continue to bring other elements of the government, and especially work with the international community to push back, establishing the expectation that these things won't be tolerated. That's all really vital.
Let me spend another minute talking about China, because we've seen some public reporting over the course of this fall about sort of the rise of the blurred lines in China between nation-state activity and cybercrime, which is something that we've seen very steadily from Russia over the years, where you have sort of nation-state hackers by day, criminals by night, or vice versa. And I wonder, at the same time, we've seen, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about the switch from Chinese hacking sort of being primarily done by the PLA, moving over to the Ministry of State Security under Xi. And I wonder if you could sort of talk to whatever level of detail you'd like about how you view those entities and sort of how you view that current evolution of what we're seeing from China.
Yeah, so across the entities, both in the military and the intel services, they're robust and resourced, right? So large teams, evolving techniques, and we see them looking to develop new tradecraft and then pass it down so it scales to bigger and broader. There are criminal elements, but what we often see is they're the commercial elements who by day are supporting those government activities, and then by night using some of the same tools, infrastructure, and other activities. And I think it's really important China understands how much of a risk that is to them, that these uncontrolled actors are, ambiguously combined with their activities, and that's a problem.
And Kevin was talking about this earlier today, that you go back a decade and he had sort of his database of 40 APTs thereabouts, and now 2,900. What does that sort of look like on your side as you're trying to monitor these threats and the proliferation of cyber actors?
What we're seeing is there's a lot of tradecraft that utilizes commercial, open source, and even outdated tools because they work. They aren't going to get you into the most protected networks, but many of the targets are soft enough that you can come in with those commercial tools. And what we've seen is we've seen whole APTs kind of go dark to some of the commercial entities who said, yeah, I don't see those custom tools from name your favorite threat actor group, when in reality they're just as active, but what they're using now is some of the commercial tools that get them to the same outcomes. So it's clouded that space. We do see there's always interest. We talk about the big four in cybercrime, but almost every nation in the world now has a cyber exploitation program. The vast majority of those are used for espionage and intelligence purposes. But there is interest in dabbling in offensive cyber and outcomes. The difference between the top of the list and the bottom of the list usually is scale. The idea of how many people they have, how many resources they can bring to bear, how much they can do at once. There's really some high-end, sophisticated small actors, but they're confined to whatever that national interest is that they're aimed at. So we see less of them.
Any you'd care to name at this time?
No, thanks.
And then going back to those big four, talk a little bit about Iran, talk a little bit about North Korea, countries that we haven't heard a lot about, sort of rising above the noise of the last couple of years, or the last year or so, but assuming are sort of still out there and actively engaged.
Iran's still active. They were certainly first and foremost back when everybody was talking about the bank's DDoS and the Shmoon wiper virus. Still actively engaged in offensive cyber. But what we're seeing is they're often very focused on regional things right now, right? They haven't been as focused on broader impacts, but they're capable, and most importantly, they're dangerous because they're less judicious in what they decide is a reasonable action. And I think at times Iran doesn't understand just how much they've gone up to and even over the line, to the point where they've drawn the ire and concern of the greater community.
In North Korea?
North Korea is still very, very focused on creating wealth for the regime, because there's not many more sanctions the world can put on North Korea. And so they've got to find ways to generate currency, to make exchange. And they found that stealing Bitcoin is often easier than stealing from the Bank of Bangladesh. So they haven't been hitting the biggest banks quite as aggressively, because they're making their money in the crypto space. We also see they really, the commercial firms were dealing with a lot of North Korean issues back when the vaccine was an issue. They were going after the intellectual property of vaccine makers. So still active, still a threat, very capable, but mostly focused on crypto exchanges and creating money.
You mentioned in that context Bitcoin again, which is something that we've heard sort of come up a couple of times in both specific and then more generally cryptocurrency. How much of the ransomware problem do you see as a criminal problem, and how much of it is a cryptocurrency problem?
Yeah, I don't know how to gauge those. I mentioned the 4 levers we see. We've got to go after all of that, right? Certainly, without profit, there is no ransomware problem. And the way the profit comes out these days is through crypto. Crypto is both a benefit and a liability. You saw some awesome DOJ activities where cryptocurrency was seized. There's ability to watch those transactions. They're all very public. The question is, can you de-anonymize and connect them in? There's opportunity and risk in the crypto space.
Let me ask you a couple of questions here about your current role atop the Cybersecurity Directorate. This is a directorate within NSA that was stood up by Ann Neuberger circa 2 years ago. When you arrived earlier this year to take over the directorate, sort of what is the top of your agenda for the next couple of years, and what do you see as the way that fits into this broader constellation of government tools right now?
Sure. Well, the key aspect we have in the Cybersecurity Directorate is we have that foreign intelligence against the cyber threat landscape. So we can reach out, understand tools, infrastructure, intent, and often get to the left of theft, right? Really, that's the goal for everybody, is to prevent. We really don't want the government or any institution to be really good at incident response. We've got to be ahead of that. So trying to land that threat intel into the best space we can to inform across whether it's critical infrastructure partnerships with CISA, some of the criminal activity with FBI, whether it's the defense of the national security systems and the Defense Department activities, or even out into the broader defense intelligence arena. So intel to drive all of that is number one. Number two is we've got to secure our weapons systems and platforms for the Department of Defense. We've had a number of years working counterterrorism, counterinsurgency as a nation. That was the top priority. We weren't thinking about the near-peer challenges of a China and a Russia. And in that, we weren't always modernizing the weapons and the capabilities of the department to the level we need, and we are laser focused on that right now. So it's getting the capabilities. These things are often wings with computers strapped to them, floating computers, flying computers, exploding computers, and we haven't always treated them as things that we had to protect like computer networks. And so now the instrumentation, the protection, the modernization is really a high priority. The other thing we're doing is we've stood up the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, and that is an outreach effort to the defense industrial base, protecting and working to take that superpower of intelligence and operationalize it. It's no good if we know it and don't do anything about it. And we've had some really awesome activities over the course of the last 9 months where we've been behind some pretty big activities to disrupt at scale, places where we took information from the defense industrial base, married it with SIGINT, had an analytic ongoing conversation, so not just information getting thrown over the fence, but the deep analyst to deep analyst, and then that information spread out into other sectors, and we were able to help contribute to bigger defensive outcomes that scaled much beyond the defense industrial base. Talking to companies who are cloud providers, infrastructure providers, where their dedicated defense teams talk to the SIGINTers and do it at an unclassified level so that it can be operationalized, that's really magical.
You mentioned the cloud there, and I wonder if you could talk about, from the NSA and the Cybersecurity Directorate perspective, how does the shift to the cloud change the way that you all do your work?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the move to the cloud has both benefits and problems. You know, I talked years ago, the cloud is just a fancy way to say somebody else's computer, right? And so now what you're doing is you're trusting them to run a lot of the security aspects, make some infrastructure and architecture decisions that you don't get to participate in now. So that's a downside. The upside is most of the big cloud providers are really outstandingly resourced with exceptional people, and they get to see activity at scale. They get to look at, across a number of customers, what threats are coming at them, so they get to maneuver with a sophistication even large companies and especially small and mediums can't. So very beneficial. But the downside is now, if you've got this cloud system, it used to be we could take a box, a server into our lab, and we could shake it until the vulnerabilities fell out. And then we could talk about how to mitigate those vulnerabilities or how to get them patched and upgraded so that they're no longer a liability. I can't go ahead and grab somebody's cloud infrastructure and shake it till the vulnerabilities fall out, right? And so we're reliant on them and their processes to do that same thing. And so the question is that the visibility and the expertise that is necessary? We probably got to find some ways to just make sure that the systemic risk in some of those cloud architectures really take advantage of all the knowledge across the community.
Mm-hmm. And we've spent a lot of this day talking about systemic risk and the way that sort of government and the private sector can collaborate, should collaborate around this. What are the systemic risks from your seat that keep you up at night and that you wish we were paying better attention to as a industry and as a society right now?
For me, looking at the national security space and the defense industrial space, it's tech debt. Right? There's a lot of things we know need to be modernized, upgraded, changed, but it's getting the resources and the will to put the investment in there. That's certainly one thing. Second thing I'll highlight is I'm starting to get very focused on quantum-resistant cryptography.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question of when that computer will arrive. For those of us that have to secure classified information for decades, we're already in that window that, you know, the potential for one emerging could put information at risk that we want to protect. I'm less worried about that as a big, surprise event and more focused on it's just a big lift to go through and understand everywhere in your system that you have confidentiality algorithms, encryption algorithms, but also authentication protocols that rely on things that'll be vulnerable to a quantum computer. And so it's really starting to think about how do we plan for that? You know, it's a Y2K problem with orders of magnitude bigger.
And how well do you think NSA is doing at that progress towards quantum-resistant encryption? I mean, this is the NSA is sort of the people that we asked to do, the world's most sophisticated math and the world's most sophisticated encryption. And how do you think you're handling that mission right
so
now?
I'm feeling really good. There are, for the classified networks, we already have the protocols and the encryption technology. We're working with our partners at NIST, who are running a public competition to select the commercial standards, and that's proceeding apace. But it really is, after you have those things, it's the retrofit. It's the get it into everything and build it backwards.
You have a unique background coming into the role that you do now as the former head of TAO within the NSA. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of what lessons and approaches you bring from sort of going from an offense role into a defense role.
Yeah, so I really subscribe to the model, it takes a thief to catch a thief, right? The idea that doing and actively exploiting makes you understand with a different mindset where the vulnerabilities and weaknesses really are. And so that informs where we prioritize on defense all the time. I think the key aspect is we put in the time to win on an exploitation effort at a much greater level than often the defensive teams do. And so there's a lesson in that, right? You've got to know, Jen Easterly talked earlier, you can't defend a system if you can't see a system. Well, you can't defend the system if you don't know the system. So understanding that technology, things like software bill of materials, been brought up several times today. The idea of really penetration testing and challenging your assumptions about your network and infrastructure. The as designed is different than the as built, and that's where the exploiters win. And so you've got to come up with concepts that continually understand how you're configured, how you're upgraded, and then you've got to move at a pace and a scale that when there are brand new vulnerabilities and techniques, you've got to kind of retroactively go back and say, how is that going to impact me, and what do we need to do? There's no doubt that systems will be penetrated. The question is, how fast can you recognize, and then how fast can you respond to either limit that or drive things out to the point you have confidence again?
Let me ask you sort of a final question here about COVID and the NSA. Sort of one of the conversations we've all been having here over meal tables is the way that work is going to change for companies going forward. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how COVID has changed the way that the NSA works, and what, if any, changes you think it's going to look different going forward based on the way that the world has changed in the last 18 months.
Great question. It really accelerated our drive to unclassified systems. That wasn't a natural place for NSA, an organization of secrets. And so it pushed us to really look and say, what has to be classified and what can be done on the outside. So a lot of technology development, software development, HR processes, business processes, either moved to the low side or are being moved to the low side. It also really increased the demand and the resilience of our low side networks, where we never had to do at scale. So it changed us like the rest of the world. There's still a lot of work that has to be done in SCIFs and in classified environments. And we were one of the first federal government organizations to come back 100%. And so there will be things that won't change in that environment. But especially cybersecurity, we're appreciating how much more we can do on the low side.
Great. Rob Joyce, thank you so much for joining us at the Aspen Cyber Summit. That does it for us today. Tune in next Wednesday, same time, same place, for the day 2 of the Aspen Cyber Summit. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, PwC, and then our sponsors, Autodesk and McKinsey & Company, for helping to take today's conversations possible. So, Rob, thanks.
Thanks for hosting such a great event.